Hello, everyone. This is Tom Armitage. I'm still waiting for people to join the meeting, so we'll wait just a little longer before we get started.
Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Morning.
Morning
Morning.
or afternoon, depending on where you are.
Well, hello, everyone. This is Tom Armitage. I think we'll get started. We have a quorum, and so I'm going to get going. Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Armitage from the EPA Science Advisory Board office, and I'm the designated federal officer for the EPA Science Advisory Board. And I'd like to convene this public meeting of the chartered SAB. And I'm just going to make a few brief remarks before we begin. The SAB is meeting today to review the science supporting a proposed EPA rule and to discuss recommendations received from a work group regarding the review of science supporting some planned EPA regulatory actions. I'd first like to note that the EPA Science Advisory Board is an independent expert federal advisory committee. The SAB is chartered under the authority of the Federal Advisory Committee Act and empowered by law to provide scientific and technical advice to the EPA administrator. The Science Advisory Board's meetings and deliberations are held as public meetings that meet the requirements of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. The discussions of the SAB and its interactions with the public are conducted in sessions where I, as the DFO, am present to ensure that the requirements of the Federal Advisory Committee Act are met. Federal Advisory Committee Act also requires that public meetings provide an opportunity for public comment. We do have a public comment period on the agenda for this meeting. Members of the public who have registered in advance with the SAB office can make oral comments during the comment period. I just want to note that we have not received requests from members of the public to provide oral comments at this meeting. Members of the public may also submit written comments for the consideration of the SAB. And any written comments that are received are provided to SAB members and posted on the SAB website. Also, I want to note that the minutes of this meeting will be prepared to summarize the discussion and action items in accordance with the requirements of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. The minutes will be certified by the SAB chair and posted on the SAB website. We're holding this meeting virtually using Zoom, so I want to let all meeting attendees know that we have provided members of the public access to this meeting through both a teleconference line and a live webcast, and that all materials being discussed are available on the SAB website. SAB consists of special government employees appointed by the EPA. Board members are serving as independent scientific and technical experts and not as representatives of any group. And as government employees, all SAB members are subject to applicable ethics laws. I want to inform all at the meeting today that the SAB staff office has determined that members participating in this meeting have no financial conflicts of interest or appearance of lack of impartiality concerning the topics on the agenda of this meeting. So before I take roll, I just want to note a couple of other points for the record. I'd like to ask those who are listening on the live webcast to let me know that they attended the meeting by sending me an email at armitage.thomas@epa.gov. So I'm going to be turning over the meeting to Tom Brennan, Director of the SAB office, and to Allison Cullen, Chair of the SAB. But before I do that, I just want to go through the roll. And so I'd like to ask SAB members and board liaisons to indicate that they're present when I call your name. Dr. Allison Cullen,
Present.
Dr. Marjorie A. Leon,
Present.
Dr. David Allen,
Present.
Dr. Susan Annenberg,
Present.
Dr. Florence Honorio, Dr. Joe Arvai,
Present.
Dr. Barbara Beck is not present, Dr. Roland Benke,
Present.
Dr. Tammy Bond, Dr. Mark Borsek is joining later, Dr. Sylvie Bruder,
Present.
Dr. Jay Chakraborty,
Present.
Dr. Amin Chen,
Present.
Dr. Amy Childress,
Present.
Dr. Wei Sui Chu,
Present.
Dr. Ryan Emanuel.
Present.
Thank you. Mr. Earl Fordham,
Present.
Dr. John Guggenheimer,
Present.
Dr. Steve Hamburg,
Present.
Dr. Celine Hernandez Ruiz,
Here.
Dr. Alina Irwin,
Oh, I'm sorry, here.
thank you, thank you. Dr. David Kaiser is not here today. Dr. Mark Le Chevalier,
Present.
Dr. Angela Lung,
Present.
Miss Lisa Lonefight, Dr. Lala Ma,
Present.
Dr. John Morris,
Present.
Dr. Enid Neptune, Dr. Sheila Olmsted,
Present.
Dr. Austin Omer,
Present.
Dr. Gloria Post,
Present.
Dr. Christy Pullen-Fednick,
Present.
Dr. Amanda Rodewald,
Present.
Dr. Emma Rosie,
Present.
Dr. John Samet,
Present.
Dr. Leanne Shepard, Dr. Drew Schindel,
Present.
Dr. Janae Smith, Dr. Richard Smith, Dr. Daniel Stram,
Present.
Dr. Peter Thorne,
Present.
Dr. Godfrey Uzachekwu,
Present.
Dr. Wei-Sung Wang, Dr. June Weintraub,
Present.
Dr. Jacoby Wilson, Dr. Dominic van der Mensbrug.
Present.
Thank you. And now the board liaisons, Dr. Robert Chapin, Dr. Dina Scher, Dr. Daniel Schlenk,
Present.
Dr. Paul Gilman.
Present.
Great. Thank you all very much.
Hey, Jacoby's here.
I'm sorry. Jacoby, you're here? Yes.
Yeah, present. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Okay, thank you all very much. With that, I'm going to turn it over now to Mr. Tom Brennan, Director of the SAB Office, for introductory remarks.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, good. I'm having some technical problems with my Wi-Fi today, so I'm calling in by phone. But hello, everyone, and welcome to this public meeting of the SAB. Today's agenda focuses entirely on actions identified by the science supporting EPA decisions process. And I figured it was a good time to reflect on that because it's been almost a year since the SAB started this new process to review the science supporting EPA regulatory actions. When today's meeting is over, the SAB will have evaluated 39 proposed rules over the past 12 months. The science supporting EPA decisions process has improved scientific integrity at EPA and was recently highlighted as a best practice for scientific integrity by the administrator in an email to staff. I would like to thank the entire SAB for your efforts over the past year on this specific line of our work, and a special thanks to the SAB work group and the SAB staff office team for working so hard to fulfill our mission. For today's meeting, I wanted to give recognition and thanks to the SAB team who reviewed the oil and gas proposed rule that we'll be discussing today. Both members of that group of the SAB and members of the SAB staff office worked diligently through the holiday season to prepare for this review, and I thank you for your efforts. Now I'd like to turn it over to our chair, Dr. Allison Cullen.
Thank you so much, Tom. And we all owe a huge debt of gratitude to Tom Brennan for shepherding that science supporting EPA decisions process through many different administrative channels. So thank you so much. And thanks to the staff office. And I'm also having a bumpy internet today, so I will carry on as I am, but someone should flag me if my sound starts getting bumpy, and I will also call in. I'd rather do it this way if I can. So good afternoon and good morning. I'm Allison Cullen. I'm the chair of the EPA Science Advisory Board, and I want to welcome members of the chartered SAB, the SAB liaisons, EPA staff, and others to this public meeting of the EPA Science Advisory Board. I want to begin by reviewing the purpose of the meeting and the meeting agenda, and you've already heard a little bit about that. The chartered SAB is meeting today to discuss the scientific and technical basis of the EPA's proposed rule, emissions standards for new, reconstructed, and modified sources, and emissions guidelines for existing sources, oil and natural gas sector climate review. That will be the bulk of our meeting. We'll also discuss recommendations received from the SAB work group for review of science supporting EPA decisions. You just heard a bit about that process concerning SAB review of EPA planned regulatory actions. So in terms of a little more detail on our agenda, the first item is public comments. However, we have not received any requests from the public. I would like to note that members of the public also have an opportunity to submit written comments, and any written comments received will be posted on the SAB meeting webpage and made available to SAB members. And then in addition, there is a second public comment opportunity at the meeting today. Members of the public who wish to provide short 2 or 3 minute clarifying comments near the end of the meeting today should send an email to Tom Armitage, the designated federal officer, before the scheduled break. His email address is on the SAB meeting website. Moving ahead, the second item is discussion of the science and technical basis of the proposed rule. I just gave the title of it. We will discuss a draft report developed by the SAB Oil and Gas Climate Rule Work Group. And again, thank you so much to the work group over the holidays and before that, working diligently. The work group's draft report provides advice in response to questions focusing on important topics addressed in the proposed rule, and these include the super emitter category designation, evaluating and certifying advanced emission measurement and monitoring technologies, scope of covered facilities, integration of the proposed rule with emission reporting frameworks, needs for new human and institutional capacity, benefit analysis, and environmental justice. So to begin the discussion of the proposed oil and gas rule, I will ask Dr. David Allen, who's the chair of the work group, to provide a summary of the work group report, the topics and the questions addressed, and report conclusions, and then we will discuss responses to each of the charge questions developed by the SAB work group. Dr. Allen and members of the group will lead the discussion of each charge question and response in terms of their draft report. And we'd like to hear any comments and suggested report revisions or additions that SAB members would like to provide. And then after discussing responses to the charge questions, we'll discuss the key points included in the report preamble and summary of recommendations. And we will need to reach agreement on any changes that are needed in the work group's draft report during our discussion. We can also discuss findings or recommendations beyond the scope of the charge questions. And we don't have to develop the revised report text at this meeting. If we can agree on report changes, then I will ask members to send revised text to Tom Armitage, the designated federal officer for the chartered SAB, and also the DFO for the work group, Brian Bloomer. And then we can agree, or we could agree that Dr. Allen and I will work with the DFOs to incorporate changes after the meeting. So we have a couple of different avenues available to us. And then following the discussion of the oil and gas rule, we'll discuss recommendations provided in the memorandum from the SAB work group for review of science supporting EPA decisions. We had a few actions. We have 6 planned actions there, and we'll decide whether we want to agree with the work group recommendations or decide whether any follow-up actions are needed. The memorandum providing those work group recommendations is posted in the materials for the meeting on the SAB website. So now just turning to the SAB members for a moment, are there any questions about the items on the agenda for today? Looks like we don't. So I think I will turn it over then to Dr. Allen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Cullen. I chaired the work group on the new source performance standards for the oil and gas climate rule review, and working on that group were the people that are listed on a set of slides that we're going to project. And so I'd ask if those could be projected. The group had a number of recommendations, and we thought it would be useful to have those recommendations up on a screen as we go forward. So again, I'm Dave Allen. I chaired the work group, and the members of the work group are Susan Annenberg, Tammy Bond, Steve Hamburg, Drew Schindel, and Sakobi Wilson. So thanks to all that work group for the efforts put in over the last several months. What I'm going to do here is several things. First, I'll give an overview of the process that we went through and the schedule that we were on. Then second, I'll summarize the major categories of recommendations, and then I will quickly go through all of the recommendations. What we'll do after that quick summary is pause for a moment, see if there are questions, but then go into a more detailed discussion of each of these categories of recommendations that we have. There are a number of categories and recommendations, and we'll go through each of them, and various members of the work group will lead the discussion of those. We've set those up in order so that the maximum number of work group members could participate in those discussions. So we'll do the discussion of the recommendations in an order slightly different than the order in which they appear in the report. So that's the plan. Let me begin by going to the next slide and talking about the process that we went through. So this work group was formed as a subset of the board to review a proposed rule that had appeared in November of 2021. The board approved the work group to work on this rule and look at the scientific and technical basis of the proposed rule in its late May meeting, and we established the group in June. And we began our review process throughout the summer. Then, however, in November of this year, President Biden at the Conference of Parties in Egypt in November of this year, announced a supplemental proposal, which was subsequently published in the Federal Register on December 6th of 2022. That material was also reviewed by the work group. It really compressed the amount of time that we had available for the review. The proposals consisted of approximately 1,000 pages of material and supporting materials. And we identified a series of issues on the scientific and technical basis of the proposed rule, both in the original proposal and in the supplemental proposal. That resulted in 8 charge questions for deliberation and roughly 6 overarching topics. And I'm going to go over what those overarching topics are now. So next slide. And this is the order in which these appear in our report. So the first overarching topic is the creation of a new category of sources that are referred to as super emitters, defined in the rule, and we'll go into what the definition of that is. And also the use of advanced measurement technologies to identify those super emitters. And those advanced measurement technologies can be certified, which raises scientific and technical issues. And then certified technologies can be applied by third parties, reported to the EPA and to the operators of the facility, with subsequent requirements on the operators of the facilities to respond. So a number of new issues within this super emitter program. Second thing that the supplemental proposal did in the last little over a month is to change the scope of the proposed rule. The original proposal had limited the applicability of the rule based on the size of a facility. The supplemental proposal included all facilities. The data being collected in this rule will have implications for emissions reporting, and that emissions reporting in turn informs and affects other types of activities, such as fees on methane emissions established in the Inflation Reduction Act. So we noted these issues. All of these activities will require new capabilities, particularly things like advanced measurement technology. So we commented on capacity building. We also had some scientific and technical comments on the benefits estimation. And there were also some issues related to the social cost of greenhouse gases that appeared in the benefits estimation, and then as part of this proposed rule that we'll talk about when we get to the details of that. And then finally, as with all the rules that the board is considering, there are environmental justice issues and some that are specific to this rule. So these are the 6 main categories. A lot of different recommendations under each of these. I'm going to quickly run through these in the order that they appear in the report, and then we'll pause for a moment, see if there are any immediate questions, but then dive into a discussion of each of these major categories led by different members of the work group. So if we could go to the next slide, here are some recommendations that appeared on this super emitter category. So broadly, and again, more detail later, but the work group drafted language saying that the board supports the designation of a super emitter source category and at the threshold proposed by the agency. But because these super emitters will be detected by advanced measurement technologies where the technology is evolving, we recommend that the EPA periodically re-examine this threshold. We also strongly support the proposed use of advanced measurement technologies in the detection of the super emitters. and have comments on the nature of the certification of these technologies. The third recommendation under this category is encouraging EPA to work with other entities to develop emission testing capabilities to promote the development of these advanced technologies. And again, I noted a moment ago that the detection of super emitters and reporting to the agency by deployers of certified measurement technologies requires a response, and the SAB supports requiring responses to these detections, but we recommend that the response as it's defined by the EPA take into account the fact that some of these super emitting events may be relatively transient. Finally, in this category, the SAB recommended that the EPA develop and periodically update frameworks for comparing these different alternative measurement technologies. So a lot of recommendations in this area, but a lot of precedent setting in the science and technology underlying this rule. So that's the first category. I'll move on to the second category. On the scope of the proposed rule, extending it from a subset of oil and gas facilities based on various thresholds to all oil and gas facilities, we drafted language stating that the board supports the inclusion of all facilities in the proposed rule and look at also further looking at measures that reduce flaring. Next category, please. The data collected with all these measurements that will come in as part of, for example, the super emitter category can inform emission inventories, and we recommend that the EPA develop and periodically update consistent and transparent mechanisms for using these measurement data to create measurement-informed emission inventories, such as in the greenhouse gas reporting program, which in turn is being used to establish methane fees and other activities in activities outside of this rule. Next category. With many new advanced measurement techniques, there'll be a lot of capacity building that's necessary, both technical capacity for people working directly on implementing these technologies, but also in the context of environmental justice, including community-based organizations that will need capacity building in order to be able to deploy effectively some of these advanced technologies. So we encourage the EPA to engage multiple stakeholders to build that capacity. Next category. On the benefits estimation, we have two recommendations. One recommendation is that the EPA include an estimate of the monetized value of the ozone health benefits that are attributable to methane emission reductions. And the second is that we encourage the EPA to move forward towards trying to estimate hazardous air pollutant related health benefits. Within this category, we'll also bring up the issue of the major benefit that was assumed in looking at this rule, which was the social cost of greenhouse gases. And there were supplementary materials that came along with this proposed rule that we'll talk about in this context related to the social cost of greenhouse gases. Next topic. And then finally, on environmental justice, we have a number of recommendations. We recommend that future environmental justice analyses include exposures and health in near source communities. We encourage looking at communicating the valuation of distributed effects of climate change. We recommend that the EPA look at the spatial distribution of many of these benefits associated with these rules and the environmental justice implications of those. And finally, the board, consistent with many other recommendations of the board, recommends that environmental justice be included in a systematic and quantitative way in its regulatory impact assessment. So those are the major categories. And let me pause here for a moment before we dive into a more detailed description of each of these recommendations. Hopefully you now have a sense of an overview of the recommendations related to this rule, but let me pause and see if there are any immediate questions or any thoughts from any members of the work group before we describe in more detail the recommendations. So any questions or thoughts from work group members? Okay, then what I'd like to do is go back to the slide deck where we had left off. We surveyed our work group members about when they'd be available for this call today. Not all work group members are available for the entire call, so we took these a little bit out of order, and we're going to start with the last couple of charge questions. And so if we could go to the next slide. The seventh charge question, looking at benefit analyses. We posed the charge question, are the technical analyses of the benefits of the proposed rule scientifically sound, following best practices and applying state-of-the-art scientific understandings? And our plan was to have Dr. Bond lead this discussion. I didn't hear her on the call when we were taking roll, but is Dr. Bond on the line? If not, I'll ask Dr. Schindel to talk about some of these recommendations. Tammy, are you on the line?
So Dave, Dr. Bond isn't able to join us until 1 o'clock Eastern time. So in about 30 minutes, we're expecting her to join.
Okay. Maybe then, just bearing the board's indulgence, maybe perhaps we'll go on and consider them in order then. And so why don't we go to charge question 1, which should be after a couple of slides. And so we'll go through them in order. Oh, you just slip through it. So we're on charge question 6 now on the screen. I wanted to go to charge question 1. All right.
It's freezing up for some reason. Give me 1 second.
Well, I'll begin just giving a preamble for this, and I have the slides up on my screen. And so let me go ahead and here we are. All right. So this deals with the super emitter category, and I'm going to go ahead and lead this discussion. I'll describe the charge question and then our recommendation on it. And after I've done that, I'll ask if any of the other work group members want to add anything, and then we'll open it up for general discussion. So we had a couple of charge questions related to this super emitter category. And so the first question was to comment on the definition of a separate emission category of super emitters, which uses a threshold of detected methane emissions, an instantaneous observation at a rate of 100 kilograms an hour. And the question that was asked is treatment of a separate super emitter category likely to result in significant climate benefit? And is the choice of 100 kilograms an hour a reasonable threshold for identifying super emitters? So this concept of a super emitter has been well documented over the last 5 to 10 years in the scientific literature, although the precise definition of a super emitter with this rate threshold is new. What's been found throughout the United States in these scientific studies have been that the super emitters at these rates constitute a significant fraction on a national basis of total emissions. However, there's substantial spatial variability. Some production regions emit much more and have much higher fractions of super emitters than other basins. So it's a regional phenomenon in that some regions have much more in the way of super emitters than others, but on a national basis, they constitute a reasonably large fraction of total emissions, although from area to area it can vary. We endorse the rate of 100 kilograms an hour because at that rate, the emissions that are being observed are substantially above what would be expected from normal engineering operations and engineering estimates based on the processes of what the emission rates would be. And so even incorporating an uncertainty into the measurement of these emission rates, the work group felt that there was a significant amount of gap between this threshold and what routine emissions are. And therefore we endorsed the threshold as it was proposed. But we also recognize that the measurement technologies are evolving very rapidly. In addition, as the rule is implemented and other emission sources beyond super emitters are reduced, it should be possible to change this threshold, perhaps having a lower threshold for the super emitter category. And therefore, while we support this definition at this time, we recommend that the agency periodically reevaluate the threshold. So that's a summary of the work group's recommendation. Let me pause and see if any of the other work group members have anything to add to that.
This is just Steve Hamburg. I would just add briefly, I think the criticality of that number is the intersection of that technology, sort of re-emphasizing what Dr. Allen said, that currently there are numerous technologies that allow you to see with reliability the 100 kilograms from aircraft, satellites. There are some, as it shows in the report, but we're getting closer to that, as well as from on the ground. So it's a robust, there are multiple technologies. It's not about limiting it to one technology, but also to the point of that being revisited, there's lots of evidence that these technological detection thresholds are dropping rapidly. And I would be shocked if it wasn't significantly improved in 2 years. It's moving that quickly. So it felt very appropriate to have 100, but also to recognize that in terms of meeting the overall objectives of the regulations, lowering it, most likely lowering it, but assuming based on my last statement, in the near term is probably also likely to be a desirable outcome. Not to be pre-assumed, but something that one would expect based on the rapidly evolving technology and understanding of the distributions of emissions from across these different basins.
Thanks, Dr. Hamburg. Any other comments from work group members, and also let me open it up to any questions from the board on this recommendation. So I see Sylvie, and then John Samet and John Morris.
Thank you. I guess my question, given Steve's comments and my sense in reading the document, that the landscape might look for this threshold might look quite different in 2 years. Is there value in specifying 2 years as a versus just saying periodically, which you know,
I don't know if I should take that.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I did use 2 years, but I don't feel comfortable making, that's the perfect number. So one of the thoughts that we had discussed, and I'm actually going to put forward later, getting a little ahead of myself, is the idea that there actually be a standing committee, because this is a really interesting area with a lot of dynamic nature to it, involving a lot of science, and I commend the EPA for taking it on and appropriately taking it on. But it does require this sort of periodic, so that in fact, I think the SAB can help to drive that of saying, when does the technology have emerged? I would be careful on sort of prescriptively saying it's 2 years, or, is it a year and a half? Is it 3 years? I think, you can take bets within the end, exactly where that critical shift will occur.
right. I guess just a quick follow-up on that. I think somehow indicating that periodically is not decades, but a fairly short timestamp is important, because on the one hand, these values tend to get baked in, and then it becomes really hard to do something different if it's been baked in without any indication that this is. So I like the idea of a standing committee that can, come back and say, or some mechanism that indicates this will be is expected to be a rapid cycle review.
Dr. Samet.
This question is launched out of total ignorance, but this is specified as a rate. Does that rate have to be observed over some period of time? Or is that totally technology dependent, depending on the equipment used, so that you reach it instantaneously and therefore you're above it? It seems like a complicated problem as I read the report, and I couldn't quite sort out what the time dimension was on observation of the rate, or whether it was intrinsic to the equipment that was making the measurement or something else. It just seems unspecified.
And it is highly variable depending on the measurement technology that's being deployed. And so, for example, if you envision an airplane with downward-looking observational equipment flying over a site and then subsequently flying over hundreds more sites, it's going to be a very short duration measurement. Of satellite overpass similarly might be relatively short duration. You're going to have other types of measurements, though, that may be able to be present on the site for some period of time. The definition, as it appears in the supplemental proposal, is an emission rate of 100 kilograms per hour without any additional specificity. Right? What we know from the scientific data that are out there are that these emissions, even when they're occurring, are quite variable in what their emission rates are, and their duration is highly variable. We'll get to that in a little bit. Might be minutes, might be days or weeks. And so there's a lot of variability here. The way it's defined in the rule is an instantaneous emission rate of on the order of 100 kilograms per hour. Based on the current understanding of the state of the science, it's the work group's view is that that's an effective definition for going forward. But again, this idea of perhaps a standing committee that may be able to refine this as the science progresses would be potentially a useful thing to add to this.
Yeah, I wonder if you want to have some verbiage in about this, sort of the instrument dependence of the time period over which this is measured. I mean, at least, you know, just when I've thought about this, I mean, the comments are completely generic. It seems to me like you may want to write something about this problem. And then I assume there's different degrees of uncertainty associated with the different measurement technologies, which then adds, you know, a further consideration in interpreting an instantaneous measurement of rate. I mean, it's just not, it's not easy. And I appreciate that this threshold value seems reasonable. And then I think maybe a little more commentary about this problem would, you know, perhaps be useful. And obviously this will change as the equipment moves forward, hopefully. So
maybe I can jump in.
Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to add, I think we do have to be careful here because of these very different technologies. And that's where the certification comes in by EPA, is being able to look at how it actually operates. But again, it's evolving. So I've seen some recent data that's not in the literature yet, where you can actually quantify the duration because you're seeing the plume. So a lot of these cases, you're actually looking at a plume, right? So it's a mass that's coming out of a source. And because of the structure of that plume and the latest technologies, you can actually determine the consistency. You can even see it when it's turned off because that plume moves away from it, and you can analytically determine. But this gets into a level of sophistication that I would be very hesitant for us to comment on. This is where we would want to do it as a standing committee, in my view, and looking over their shoulder. There's a lot of really good scientists in EPA who can then do the certification to say where, you know, how do you draw that box so that it's fair, but at the same time is realistic with respect to those differences across those technologies.
okay, thanks. Yeah, appreciate the complexities here.
Dr. Morris.
Hi, yeah, I agree with all your recommendations. I just have one point for clarity. Because on page 3 on the top, you say that the 100 kilograms per hour isn't expected to be anything except unintentional, except down on the bottom of the page, you talk about routine operations result in short-term emission rates, which are going to be super emitters, and they just seem to contradict each other. So it could be a long-term goal versus a near-term event, or just a little more clarity would be helpful.
Yeah. And well, thanks for that observation. Let me just clarify it a bit for the rest of the board. There are a number of sources. For example, imagine you shut down a compressor on a natural gas site and you want to clear out the pipe, so you blow it down, right? That's known. It's not a malfunction, but many of these very large, currently allowed emission rates, things like liquid unloadings and so on, are going to be eliminated by the proposed rule. And so consequently, a lot of these big emission rates that are associated with normal operations will, if the rule is implemented in its proposed form, will disappear. And so that need to distinguish between normal and abnormal operations just based on the emission rate will be mitigated substantially. And we can clean up the language to make that as clear as possible.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Dr. Adelon.
Yes, thank you. First, I thought the discussion has been really helpful because I had questions just reading it about the 100 number. It's very round and in some ways the justifications I thought were really improved, especially Dr. Hamburg, your comment. I think even though you might not be able to specify 2 or 3 years, I think it would be really helpful on that third page on lines 21 to 22. There's sort of a general summary of, it says the SAB concludes that the super emitter threshold is a reasonable boundary that captures the largest events that constitute an important source of emissions in many regions. But for me reading it, it would be very helpful if your comment, Steve, about the technology piece might be incorporated into that, because you know, a lot of it starts with 100 and then calculates things from that number versus starting at, we want to reduce the health risk by this, or we want to reduce something by that. Therefore, we've determined that this number of 100 might be appropriate. So I realize that it's much more sort of generic, but I didn't know if you thought that might be helpful, because the subsequent paragraph then talks about the super emitters and periodically reviewing the threshold, which then could be a function, as you mentioned, of the technology and other things as well.
I might just, I have to think about it. I've made notes. The challenge we have is a little bit of a chicken and the egg. So the requirements both under the Inflation Reduction Act for the improvements in the greenhouse gas reporting program, and then also the kind of data that will be collected through the proposed regulation, will give us much greater clarity on these distributions, right? Of what are these sizes in different places. We have snapshots. We know far more now than we did a decade ago, but we still don't have nearly the level of data that we could really draw those curves with confidence across basins. I mean, we know a lot, and so I feel very comfortable we know enough for the regulation. But I think once we have those added data sets, we'll be able to answer exactly your question. And you know, is it one size fits all? Should always be the case? Or in fact, there are differences, because there are differences in the geology, which makes a difference in the operating conditions. And so, you know, that level of complexity. But we're not at a stage now that I would least recommend that we try and parse all that out, because the science isn't robust enough relative to being across geographic areas, across time, with enough detail to be able to make that.
So I guess my suggestion might be to have more of a generic comment like that's technology dependent, but have it a little bit earlier in like line 21 to 22, which is where some of that general statement about why the 100 is reasonable and acceptable. So obviously there's a lot that we don't know and a lot that we will know in the future, but that would clarify a little bit, at least in my mind, how as a group, the 100 kilograms per hour was acceptable given these caveats that you just mentioned, without going into detail about them specifically.
And that's still on page 3, line 21. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, line 21 to 22, just as a phrase, generic phrase in there to give a little bit more sense of why.
Dr. Rossi.
Yeah, thanks. I also was the periodically thing, you know, the revisit periodically. I'm wondering, I heard what Dr. Hamburg said, that it's evolving rapidly and that you wouldn't want to necessarily put a number, but I wonder if you could at least put a number that says something like at least every 5 years, or at least, you know, because the pace is changing really rapidly on the order of years, not decades. So periodically could mean decades, but I think what I heard is something like at least within the first 5 years or something. I don't know if you could agree to that, but periodically is, I think you seem to recognize that it's changing on the period of years. And so maybe you could put something in there that's about that to make it explicit.
Yeah, and I'll just note, this will be a challenge in that while the pace of technological change is very rapid right now, in 5 years' time, it may be quite different. And so I think that we'll need to choose words carefully there, but I think putting in some initial guidance on when we would expect the EPA would next look at this, and something like an initial periodicity might be the way to go.
I would feel comfortable with that as well. I think it's a great idea. Certainly, I would not be comfortable if they put it on the shelf for a decade and then come back to it.
Or even 5 years, right?
Yeah.
All right, why don't we move on to charge question 2? This still is dealing with the super emitters. The charge question was to comment on the super emitter response program. I'll describe that in just a moment. What challenges are likely to arise in the detection of emissions at the 100 kilogram per hour rate using emerging measurement technologies? And so the super emitter response program is that any third party let me emphasize that, any third party can use a certified technology, and again, I'll emphasize language here, a certified technology to go out and detect super emitters. Those super emitters then get reported to the operator and to the EPA, and the operator must respond and identify root causes of the super emitter. Those root causes need to be determined within 5 days of the report of the super emitter. So a very rapid response. So there are a number of provisions here that are really significant and that have a scientific and technological underpinning. And so the work group came up with the following 3 recommendations, which I'll just walk through. So the board supports the EPA's proposed use of advanced measurement technologies in the detection of super emitters and other methane emissions from oil and gas sector sources. We say that the advanced measurement technologies should be certified by the EPA, and the agency should partner with other federal agencies and external organizations to develop robust testing and certification programs. For that partnership with other federal programs, let me give you a specific example that influenced the work group's thinking. A number of years ago, I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago, the Department of Energy, through the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy, ARPA-E, funded a group of projects to develop new measurement technologies, and as part of that established a methane emission technology evaluation center that exists now at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. And so there's a DOE funded and operated facility for testing technologies. So we recommend that the EPA develop these certification methods, but also partner with other agencies that are making investments in this realm and that are likely to continue to make investments in this realm and make available testing facilities. And so the next recommendation follows along similar lines. The SAB.
Dave, maybe before you go on, I would just say one other thing. It also refers to agencies and external organizations, because one of the major efforts that's been ongoing is a group, Adam Brandt at Stanford University has been running a series of controlled releases that most of the the community that has measuring technology, sorry for that awkwardness, has participated in. And he's run this now multiple times in multiple environments, and it's been incredibly valuable to the community to have these blind releases. And METEC's a very powerful tool, but it does one thing. What Adam Brandt had set up through Stanford was another. And all this combination of certification currently outside of EPA has been a very powerful mechanism to move that whole community forward.
Right. And I'll also note that there are still other categories. So for example, in Europe, there are programs underway where at real facilities, controlled releases are being put out as part of the operations of the controlled facilities, and technologies are being tested to be able to detect controlled releases in the context of a real facilities configuration. So any of a number of these, both domestic and international organizations, lots of good work going on in Canada as well in this regard. So multiple entities out there. The EPA doesn't need to completely invent the wheel here. So we encourage the development of emission testing capabilities by EPA in collaboration with these other organizations to ensure that the development of certification of measurement technology can proceed at a pace that's consistent with the development of these technologies. So keep up the rapid pace. And then the SAB supports requiring responses to super emitter detections by certified measurement technologies. But we recommend that the EPA think about the problem of how long these events last. And so if the requirement is that you detect a super emitter, it gets reported, and then within 5 days, you find out what a root cause is, well, the emission may or may not persist that long. There will be super emitters that will persist for long periods of time. There will be others that are relatively short in duration. And so while we don't make a specific recommendation about how to address that, because the science and the understanding of this is still very much evolving, we still think that this needs to be part of what the EPA considers as it evaluates what the response needs to be. So let me open it up here to see if any other work group members have anything to add to this, and then we'll open it up again for discussion. So any other comments from work group members?
If I could jump in just on the third one on this persistence issue, this is as Dave said, a challenging area. Again, I think we're very supportive of the need to have follow-up, but we have to be careful that because we know that there have been very large events that occur over very short periods of time. We also know that there are events that happen that have very highly variable rates. So it's not you measured at one time versus another. And so EPA needs to recognize that so that it isn't a one size fits all, where if you don't see it, it calls into question whether the original observation was valid. Because there have been studies, I've personally been associated with a series of studies doing exactly this kind of follow-up in local distribution systems, and the majority were able to be defined, but not all of them. But that doesn't mean they didn't exist. We know in some cases they did exist, but because of environmental conditions, they weren't present then at the later date. So this is a critical issue. And again, as we get more data, you'll be able to get more refined approaches, but we need to recognize this added complexity to ensure that the response systems are suitable to the data as it's going to be observed and doesn't lead to any misunderstanding of what the absence at a later date means relative to the time when it was observed.
So again, a recommendation of periodic revisiting, and we'll note here that the comments from the board on perhaps having a standing committee would be relevant to this as well, and periodically revisiting this issue of how do you handle the response when the persistence can be highly variable. Any comments from the board on this one? Mark.
This just seems, I'm not sure your review of this raises a lot of questions in my mind around the practicality and feasibility of this, and just the variability of different measurements. Your emphasis that any third party could, have a measurement. Difficult to come back and validate that because of the transient nature of this. This just reads to me like it's not really ready for a regulation. Maybe a data collection effort to kind of validate these approaches and the rest. It almost seems like it's codifying a research project. So this raises just a lot of questions in my mind around, is this really being pushed out something that is, needs more validation of approaches? Is it really ready for a regulation?
Well, let me first just clarify. This is not our recommendation that it be certified technologies deployed by any third party. That is the proposal from the EPA. All right, it's not our recommendation. That is the proposal.
So that raises a question for me around, is this really ready to be done? Since there's, I mean, you could have any kind of methodology. So we could have, later on talk around, I have a satellite fly over and, and collect that, but someone comes back with a ground-based measurement. And so there's differences in methodology and sensitivity and the rest. I mean, all of these things would be brought into regulation to say, there needs to be a lot more uniformity and consistency in this approach. And it seems to me like it's really, and as you just said, it's a very emerging area. So there's a lot of different methodologies and approaches being done. And, there's not real consistency in a set of approaches that are most reliable, most understandable. So it just seems to be like it's not, in my opinion, it's not really ready for regulation. It's ready for more research or more data collection. Maybe there needs to be regulated approach to kind of look at all these different emerging technologies and collect more information. And I'm not sure how it is in this approach, but in my area, there would be a lot of questions around, is this really practical and feasible, particularly when, any third party can be raising these and it has to be addressed in 5 days. I don't know. So that's my question. These are the concerns I read to this. It seems like there's a lot of questions around methodology and certification and the rest that I'm not hearing are really put to bed yet.
So let me respond to the bigger question first. I actually feel very comfortable. There have been formal studies across technologies. There are numerous paired comparisons with multiple technologies. So I'm not so concerned about the fact that it's not ready for making the measurements. You can do that. I feel comfortable. And the reason the 100 is there and why I'm very supportive of it is that's high enough, right? If you said 10, yes, we're getting, it's going to get much harder. But at 100, I feel very comfortable with it. But the issue in the third one that I see is the challenge is I feel comfortable we can measure the 100 with reliability. With some uncertainties, it's going to vary. That's why you want the EPA to certify them. So you can say, okay, this one's good to this and that, because we don't currently have a formal certification, right? There are these paired comparisons. There have been numerous of them with controlled release experiments. We talked about blind controlled release. So, it's third party. The challenge is you can make that measurement. I feel very comfortable about that. I trust the data. There are numerous, both private sector and public sector doing it. The challenge is because I can't tell you a priori whether it'll be present if I went back the next day. Some proportion will, but we know from the data some won't. That's the challenge that I see, is because the next day it won't. And that isn't a function of measurement. That's not a science problem. That's the fact that the nature of these things are not constant and it varies. So that's the response, and why the recommendation is as it is say, well, you need to remember this. So your requirement of the companies needs to reflect the fact that some of these will be on, Dave said, up to weeks, months. There are ones that have been on for years that have been recorded, right? So there are things that are they're emitting constantly, either deliberately or not, but there's others that aren't. That's the challenge for the response part. But you want a response. The only way you get a improvement is for people to go out. Historically, the industry never recorded it, never did root cause analysis.
So, but apparently there's not a certification process already in place. We can move a rule. I mean, in my area, the methods would have to be certified, they have to be approved, they have to be shown that they're practical and capability of being used before a regulation would ever be approved. This seems to be, we'll go ahead and build a regulation and we'll get all the rest of the stuff, falling behind.
Right. It's a little different, and then I'm going to be quiet. But so roughly a third of global oil and gas production, the companies that produce it have signed up for something called the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0. That requires them, this is voluntary, but requires them to make these measurements using an approved methodologies. It's not certification, But if they voluntarily have stood up, right, they're convinced they can do it. Doesn't mean they're all fully there in terms of implementing it. So there is a broader sense that this is very doable in the industry. But then you want to bring the structure of certification with it, because now you're talking about a regulatory environment, which is not
language.
Go ahead. Sorry, Dave.
The specific language that the work group came up with in the recommendation was that the EPA considers some measure of persistence in defining this response. Exactly what that is, we don't specify. We think could go in a lot of different directions, but the work group recommended that some level of consideration of persistence be included in how you define what response needs to be taken.
Okay, I think that's a real key factor. So it would have to be persistent over some period. Somebody can make a observation. Somebody could, come back and validate that. So it almost sounds like it has to be over a 5-day period. I mean, how would you?
We didn't specify it. Again, very rapidly moving area of science and understanding about these emissions. Again, I think that incorporating some sort of standing committee review might be a good addition to this report that the board might want to recommend. And that is certainly one of the periodic analyses that the work group's draft has in it.
All right, thanks for the discussion.
Peter, I saw your hand went up and down.
It did. That's because I think Steve made a number of the points that I was going to make. The only thing I would add is that having several different approved technologies for measurement and having transient emissions is not unique to methane or this industry. So, I think that the fact that things are emerging rapidly is maybe the distinguishing factor here. But I think that you can point to other examples where the certification process is rigorous. There's multiple approved methodologies. As long as any third party is using those methods and using them appropriately, then it should meet with the standards that were developed for that instrumentation.
Great. I've noted that Dr. Bond has joined us. So what I would propose at this point is that we shift gears for a moment and take advantage of her availability and go back to charge question 7. So if we could bring the slides back up. And go back to charge question 7.
Yeah, it's been a little finicky for some reason.
All right. All right.
Oh, there we go. Great.
All right, and so charge question 7 dealt with the benefits of the proposed rule and the evaluation of the benefits of the proposed rule. And so, Dr. Bond, let me turn it over to you for a discussion of this.
Thank you, Dr. Allen, and thank you for your flexibility. I apologize for my limited availability today because of teaching schedules. So I'm going to make a couple of comments that relate to both this question and then to the environmental justice charge question that we address later. And so both in this question and in environmental justice, we wanted to recognize what is possible with the current scientific support and analysis. There's a great deal of complex analysis that one could do, and we didn't find that the EPA had done anything correctly, yet we acknowledge that there was much more that could be done. And so many of these are acknowledging what's been done and also a push to move forward in future analyses. So in terms of the benefit analyses, the major emissions that could be reduced are methane that we typically talk about, and then there are a number of indirect or direct effects. One of those is the effect on tropospheric ozone of methane reductions. And that is something that was not monetized in the benefit analysis. Now, the EPA had commented that you really need to know the distribution of emissions in order to do that analysis. But it turns out that for ozone due to methane is fairly well mixed in the atmosphere. And so it's the ozone distribution that results from that methane is not going to change depending on where the emissions occur. And that analysis has already been done. How much methane is emitted and how much ozone benefit you could achieve, that's already been done, and it doesn't depend on the spatial distribution. So we just recommended that EPA could include an estimate of the monetized value attributable to methane emission reductions. Another thing that appeared in the impact analysis was a baseline of hazardous air pollutants. And again, these were not the target of the rule, but they're going to be affected by the rule. And hazardous air pollutants are very likely to affect the communities that are nearest the sources. And so in the future, it would seem that it would be good to acknowledge the fact that not just calling out that hazardous air pollutants have an effect and that this effect is distributed, possibly burdening some communities more than the others, but what will the rule do to it? This is an issue that has come up in previous scientific advisory board meetings. And then finally, the major effect of the rule is on methane emissions. And methane has been quantified with the CO2 equivalent because its primary effects are on the climate. And there's just a very rich and complex discussion on the social cost of carbon. EPA used one of the social costs of carbon. That number is likely to change, but we felt that it was beyond the scope of our work group to redo the social cost of carbon. That is an issue that needs much more discussion and agreement and is more appropriate to take place externally. And so we did not make a recommendation on that to EPA. We did suggest that the scientific advisory board keep tabs on that discussion as it evolves, because it will address, it will affect not just this rule, but many others. So that's all I have on this one.
Thank you, Dr. Bond. Let me just add a little bit more context to the social cost of greenhouse gases and social cost of carbon section of this. So many of you, I'm sure, are aware of the interagency task group of which EPA is a part. That interagency task group, which is looking at the social cost of carbon, is still deliberating, still doing work. But what the EPA did as part of the release of this rule was issue an agency, an EPA, social cost of greenhouse gases. As Dr. Bond pointed out, our work group wasn't particularly well constituted to deal with a review of that. We also noted that that social cost of carbon, social cost of greenhouse gases that appeared from the EPA as part of the release of this rule is also undergoing a separate review. And so what you see in small text above the two recommendations is the language that appears in our work group's comments on this rule that we're recommending for the board, that we didn't review that as part of our looking at this rule, but that the work group is recommending that the board monitor this activity and reserve action and recommendations as we await the review on that matter. So let me I'll open it up to any other comments from work group members, and then we'll go to John for a question.
Yeah. So one of my concerns with regard to the social cost of carbon
and methane as well, is the potential presence of tipping points in the climate and the elasticity of the social costs to the actual amount of greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere. I expect that the consequences are going to increase rapidly as greenhouse gases accumulate. We've seen that in increased fires, increased extreme weather events, and I just wonder whether we shouldn't try to make it, to express our opinion that the review, this ongoing review, should really take those into account very carefully.
Dr. Olmsted.
Thanks. Yeah, just a very quick response to John, your important comment is that those numbers do take that into account. It's one of the main reasons that the social cost of carbon and social cost of methane estimates increase over time, right? So if you look at the schedule by year, those increase over time for several reasons, but one main reason is that the increase in the stock in the atmosphere, right, also increases damages on the margin.
Okay, Dominique.
Yeah, thank you, David. I did read the EPA's report on the social cost of carbon. So they are anticipating kind of a major increase over the currently defined one used by the government. The notion, however, that there's a single social cost of carbon, I think is just a fallacious one. So I think it would be worth for the EPA and almost all of us that use the social cost of carbon to look at a range of possible values. And there's nothing that would prevent the current study from looking at the cost of this regulation using a range of estimates rather than a single point estimate.
Steve.
Yeah, I just weigh in briefly. One of the added complications, and one of the reasons at least I wasn't comfortable on the subcommittee dealing with this, is time is really critical, as was mentioned, and methane is a short-lived climate pollutant. It has very different climate effects. It affects more the rate than the overall cumulative because of and so you get I've had many conversations with economists about these damage. Can you apply a single damage function? And is so it gets complicated relative to how methane is treated versus CO2. And I don't want to get into it here, but so that's a whole nother element. We're talking about methane, and because of the temporal dynamic differences, they're quite pronounced between short-lived and long-lived climate pollutants. Just an added wrinkle to this whole issue that requires a lot of thinking and a lot of deliberate sort of addressing of these issues, and that's felt well beyond what I thought we certainly were in a position with the time and the resource, and given the others that are doing it, could take on.
And so again, the way it's handled in this report to the administrator is that the board will continue to watch this issue. But we noted that the document that was issued with the rule is undergoing review, but so we didn't make further comment on it. Let me then return to Dr. Bond and discussion of charge question number 8, which deals with environmental justice.
Thank you. And again, I'd like to start with some context. In previous scientific advisory board meetings, the question has been raised, what does it mean to do an environmental justice analysis? And typically in both in EPA reports and in much of the literature, there's a lot of presentation of here are the impacts. They are distributed with disproportionate impacts on certain communities, and it's left there, showing that there is, yes, there are disproportionate impacts, and that's a problem. And what we need to be moving toward is reducing that disproportionality. And without an analysis of what the rule does or what happens in the future, that assessment cannot be done. And so we support EPA in doing the analysis that they have done, demonstrating that those communities have been burdened. And yet there's been a call both within our subgroup and on the larger board to move beyond that as we go into the future. And so our first recommendation was that the future analyses should include the influence of rulemaking, not just the operations that are current on exposures and health in near source communities. There was also an issue that seemed to come up from the EPA's regulatory impact analysis, and that came up in the literature sometimes. And that is that it's not always the location of the facilities that results in distributed effects. Sometimes it is. Near source and fence line communities can be greatly burdened if those communities are exposed to pollutants that are going to stay in that area. But when it comes to something like methane, which is going to affect the climate system, and then the climate system affects communities differentially, then the appropriate measure is not where the facilities are located, but what happens to the climate system. And so it's a very complex sequence. And that point seemed to have been missed in some analyses. So we tried to bring that forward, identifying the pollutants and the chain of effects and how they affected communities differentially. And so that leads to the second point here. Consider how the valuation of distributed effects of climate change might be communicated, because a large portion of this rule is going to improve the amount of methane emitted, reduce it, therefore reduce climate change. And that differential effect on communities is not the same as where the emissions occur. There is not a good discussion, as far as I know, on how to value that improvement of disparity. And does it belong in the social cost of carbon, which is already a somewhat contentious discussion? And how can that be valued? I think it's clear that EPA values that improvement, that we've heard public comment before today that is valued, and yet we really have very little idea of how to bring it forward. And so again, this is not a recommendation for a change in the analysis, but that this needs to be considered in the future. With regard to the third point is similar to the first, that and is really asking for an expanded analysis in the future. What happens in the future as these rules are implemented? Does this really benefit the spatial distribution that tends to affect communities? And then finally, it's also been brought forward in the scientific advisory board, including in the cumulative impacts recommendations, that the assessment of burden and therefore assessment of rule benefits is quite complex. It's not as simple as reducing just hazardous air pollutants. Typically, communities who are near facilities or who have been otherwise burdened are not just exposed to the emissions from that facility, but to a number of stressors, a number of stressors through different media, cumulative impacts that go beyond the physical impacts. And so again, we didn't demand that the EPA consider this redoing the analyses to include these, but it's acknowledged that these are very important and that strategies need to be thinking about evaluating not just what is reduced in terms of methane or even total emissions, but how do we limit and reduce cumulative impacts? Thanks.
Any comments from any other work group members? Or the board?
Yeah, I'll just.
Thank you, Jacoby.
I'll just raise my hand. Sorry about that. I'll raise my hand first. So it didn't follow the rules. Okay, I'll go now.
Go ahead, please. You have the floor.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that, Tammy. And thanks. I think, as Tammy said, we wanted to really speak to those issues around those differential climate effects. So it's really important to highlight that and just remember that also when you think about cumulative impacts, you got to take into account the underlying sort of social stresses and vulnerabilities for those populations. And so you can have a cumulative impacts frame, but even understand the disproportionate impact. So the disproportionate impact is really important for the fence line or front line is the language we use communities. But the cumulative impacts, as Tammy already said, goes beyond that. But I think it's going to be important to really get those other stressors, which could be other chemical stressors, which could be physical stressors, biological, ecological stressors as part of that discussion. And additionally, when we think about the benefits from an environmental justice frame, and how do we do this quantitatively? Benefits, we talk about distributional justice when you think about methane reduction, and then the benefits of reducing the climate effects and reducing disparities. So reducing overall climate effects, right? And then reducing disparities in climate effects, and then the improvements that come with mitigation, right? Reduction of methane, improvements that come with mitigation. So that's distributional justice. And it's also restorative justice component that we also highlighted. And then as it relates to the rules around what we're trying to do, there's a community engagement component as it relates to representative justice. So making sure those voices of those who are at the fence line of the fossil fuel infrastructure and those who are impacted differentially by the climate effects, that their voices are in this process. So I just wanted to share that as some more of the context where as a committee, what we talked about, but where also I think the EPA is going as it relates to the strategic plan around, strategic plan and environmental justice, the integrated strategic plan, and how you do those things. So I just want to share some of that context. I'll pass the mic. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. So let's go to Dr. Chakraborty, then Dr. Smith, then Dr. Irwin.
Well, thank you, Jacoby, for answering one of my queries. So let me try a different question. One of the things we've referred to in our previous meetings is the EPA's technical guidance document for assessing EJ in regulatory analysis. And I think that emphasizes the need for establishing appropriate baselines. So I guess my question for the work group is whether or not, if you thought about modifying the baseline, or if you thought that was appropriate or adequate for measuring EJ in the context, that you mentioned in terms of the questions.
I'm not sure who you want to answer that. I would say that I think it is appropriate to look at baseline, and particularly in the context of, cumulative impact assessments, if it's cumulative impacts, health impact assessments, I think that's important. We didn't really discuss it as much, and maybe we can make a modification to make sure we have that kind of language. But as you heard earlier with the transit nature of methane, baseline, that may be difficult to do in some ways, right? But if you have a baseline as it relates to the differential climate effects, right? Those indirect, direct effects for those populations, that could be a way to do it. Even as you already know, Dr. Chakraborty, the use of mapping tools can help us visualize some of that as well. So I think there's some opportunities to bring that in more. But I'll end my comment there.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. I was wondering if a couple of sentences can be included on that. There are these tools that can provide, I can't say better, but probably spatially relevant insights on some of these issues. Thanks.
We're working on a climate equity and health mapping tool, for example. So this is not the same context, but having GHGs in there, having methane would be helpful. But it would still be some assumptions, right, and some uncertainties, with the visualization. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith.
Yeah, thank you. I only just joined the meeting, so I apologize if I'm saying something that's been covered already. I did hear a couple of comments on how climate change differentially affects minority communities, and I agree with the comment that somebody made that it's not about where the emitters are located, but there still is a growing literature on, for instance, there's a higher gradient of temperature change in minority communities than non-minority communities. And I don't know whether that's been reflected in your report already, but I'm going to take a look and possibly provide some additional references.
Yeah,
That was my comment. Thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you for that. I'll respond real quickly. I think it's a really good point. That's Dr. Shaughnessy's work has shown that red line communities versus non-line red communities, you can see higher extreme temperature, temperature gradients. And so there's a literature, and then we also could leverage some of the literature that's in the 5th National Climate Assessment for some of these again, because there's the air quality chapter. There's also, I think, a heat chapter, some other chapters that would be useful to be able to leverage some of that literature too.
Okay, thank you, Sukobi. I'll take a look and I'll follow up with you if I have any more to say.
And then you'll be a good trigger for me. Like, yeah, we got papers. We just need a cite or add a little bit of text. So yes, thanks for that.
Okay, thanks.
Dr. Irwin.
Yes, thank you. Tammy, I just wanted to follow up and ask you, as you're thinking about how to value these disparities, I mean, there is a literature on valuing health disparities in the sense that we can quantify the disparities and then look at what it would take, right, to eliminate that disparity. And then what the benefits of that would be in terms of reduced medical care costs, reduced premature deaths, and all of those things are, we can place values on those using, the economic valuation tools that we have. So did you mean something different than that? Or is that related to what you meant? I just wanted to get a little bit more clarification from you on that.
So it depends which particular thing you're referring to, but I'll speak generally, and then if I didn't get it right, you can point me in the right direction. So our recommendations are quite general. We did not redo an analysis or try to tell EPA how to do an analysis. Currently, the value of disparities isn't presented. And I think that is the case with many rules, that pretty much the baseline impact is characterized, and then it seems to be an unwritten assumption that if you have disparities in the baseline, you should do something about the overall cause, but that does not say that you're going to reduce disparities. So the kind of analysis you're talking about, I think, is well worth pursuing, and probably is in some of the recommendations on how a rule would affect disparities. But it's currently not part of the rule analysis. So that's all we were pointing to. Look not just at the baseline, but at what the change is going to be, and then include cumulative and combined impacts as well. And some of the methods you're talking about would be appropriate for that.
I gotcha. So I understand what you meant now. I think what you meant was we're not quantifying the change, and so therefore we can't understand what the improvement potentially would be on reducing disparities. But if we did
we're
do
not
that,
even
then we
that far
could.
yet.
Yeah, I gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Right then, not seeing any more questions. Let's move back to the charge questions, and we'll return to the order in which they appear in the report and go to charge question 3 if we could. Right, so this gets back to the use of these advanced measurement technologies. So the advanced measurement technologies will be used to measure emissions in from a variety of different types of sources, including super emitters, but potentially then also looking at replacing existing methods for going out and looking for emissions that are not super emitters, like leaks. And so we commented on the ways in which EPA evaluated these advanced measurement and monitoring technologies to replace existing detection and repair programs. And What EPA does in the rule is to establish a matrix of different types of approaches and uses an example of comparing overflight technologies using aircraft to going out and sending someone with an optical gas imaging camera to every site. And the matrix looks at then a variety of detection limits for the aircraft overflight and uses then varying periodicity of aircraft overflights and looks at what would be comparable in terms of emission reduction effectiveness to the existing methods of an operator periodically going out with an optical gas imaging camera. And so there's an evaluation framework that involves some rather sophisticated modeling activities. And so we recommended that EPA continue to develop those methods and periodically update them to include these new measurement technologies and what we understand about the uncertainties and limits of these new technologies, including data from emission testing systems. So that's the context of this recommendation. Let me open it up to other work group members to add to that. Any questions from the board? And Dr. Irwin, I see your hand is still up. I'm going to assume that's an old hand. Thank you. Any questions from the work group or from the board? Then let's move on to charge question 4, moving away from these advanced technologies and moving to the scope of the rule. And so I'm going to turn this over to Steve to discuss this.
Great, thanks so much. So this is one of the key changes that occurred in the updated proposed rule, was really to include all of the facilities within that's covered by the rule that are envisioned within the of the production of oil and gas, or is to include all the facilities. And this is really important because the growing literature shows that, in fact, as we talk, these super emitters are important, but the estimate for the United States in a meta-analysis is that half of the emissions come from small sources in marginal wells. So these are the wells that are at the end of their life, but that end can take decades, responsible for far less than 10% of production. But the estimate of a meta-analysis of taking all these studies that have been done to date, they're responsible for roughly half of total emissions. So ignoring these won't get the results that we're looked for. This is consistent with the literature. So EPA talked about being more inclusive in the revisions. The committee supports that approach. The subcommittee supported that approach, and I certainly do. That I think that is very reasonable, and it's a more challenging area in that, of course, you're talking about smaller absolute quantities from a much larger population of facilities. Just for example, the marginal wells in the United States account for roughly 6% of oil and gas production and are 80% of the total facilities. So 80% producing 6% of the production and responsible for roughly half of the emissions. So the recommendation is that we support basically what EPA has done in the proposed rule, recommending that EPA, that EPA provide guidance on defining model geographies of varying sizes for effective deployment of remote sensing technologies to stimulate monitor emissions from a diversity of types of facilities, and thus also supports the reduction of emissions from flaring. The literature on that one, there was a recent paper in Science that really showed that the flaring is not only a waste of resource, but it actually a direct source of methane, that the average efficiency of flares is considerably lower than EPA had assumed. I believe the standard assumption, and I will defer to Dr. Allen on this, had been 98%. The paper that was released showed that it was 91%. So that's a massive quantity of methane that's being emitted from flares. So certainly, again, if you want to reduce emissions, you need to include flaring, since the empirical data in the literature shows that, in fact, it is much less on average efficient than was assumed. So basically, this is other than the support of EPA giving recommending including flaring and supporting the including all facilities, and then just encouraging providing guidance for how to deploy remote sensing technologies across a diversity of facility types. So I'll stop with that and go ahead, Dave, and jump in.
And I'll just add a little bit to this, explaining some of the somewhat complicated wording in this recommendation. So for those of you never been to an oil and gas production area, it would not be unusual within a square kilometer to have 2, 4, 6 different individual pads. And so what you're doing is actually physically sending somebody on one of those pads to look for emissions. And it's relatively unambiguous what it means to go look. On the other hand, if you're beginning to deploy some of these advanced technologies, like, for example, imagine a open path, long path instrument that is able to make measurements from a single point and then at multiple points that might encompass many different individual facilities, if the facility is defined as a pad, then you may only need one sensor per multiple pads. And so what constitutes visiting a facility needs to be understood in the context of the technologies that are being deployed. And that's the basis for some of the wording in this particular recommendation. So with that, let me open it up to additional questions or comments from others. Dr. Cullen.
Yeah, I'm just curious, given Dr. Bond's comments earlier, and this is so interesting, the large fraction that's associated with the smaller facilities. I'm just wondering, are there EJ implications? Are there different associations between where the smaller facilities are and the location of overburdened communities, or do we know anything about that? I think I'm raising it because maybe we don't, but it might be interesting to know. And given that it's a huge, I mean, this is, Steve was just saying, it's like half of it counts for about half. Am I asking
Right.
in an organized enough way? Thank you.
Yes. So a couple of things just to clarify. This is probably my mistake. So smaller means smaller relative to emissions, because a lot of these facilities are actually just older, and because a resource, the resource depletes over time, but it has a long tail of production. So you get the bulk early, and then and literally, I know in the Permian, I off the top of my head, Dave may be able to provide better. You know, there's a large portion, I don't want a large portion, significant number that are 40 years old. So small being production, not physically the size. It's not a small size.
No, I think I'm still, I think I'm still interested in my question, but yes, understood.
Yeah. No, I just want to clarify that.
Yeah,
So
thanks.
then the question on the impacts, there is which we do cite, there is a literature looking at just the physical proximity. What I don't remember off the top of my head if there's any correlation with older versus newer. There is absolutely correlation that's well documented to show, and it is skewed, so it's not, representative of the whole population, that underrepresented groups, low income and minority communities are disproportionately closer to facilities I'm not positive on the size of those, are those the older or the newer? And that I don't remember. I simply don't remember from the
Yeah,
literature.
thanks. No, that was what I was curious about.
And we do
Dr.
cite
Wilson.
that literature in the report.
Thanks.
Dr. Wilson?
Oh, just saying that's a great question. And just from an environmental justice perspective, a lot of the facilities based on the regulations, you call them, sometimes you use the term orphan, like the landfills, for example, that term has been used. You've seen that type of disproportionate burden, or the grandfather facilities, they end up having the long-term impact. And we have examples of coal ash landfills, for example, permitted over and over again because they've been grandfathered, right? And so I think that's something to take, to really maybe take another look at, just to highlighting how those older facilities that have been either orphaned or grandfathered could potentially be disproportionately near these underrepresented populations. I just wanted to follow up and appreciate that question that was asked.
Yeah, I think I didn't ask it very well, but I was reflecting on what Dr. Bond said before. If we're trying to understand the impact of regulation on disproportionate impact, that's what motivated me to ask, right? So the fact that they would no longer be exempt, they would now be included. I just wondered, then thanks.
I just say one clarification again, Dr. Allen can correct me if I got this wrong, but orphaned wells would not be included in this regulation because by definition, they're orphaned, meaning there's no one legally responsible. That's the whole problem. And those would be just out there. There are not good maps of them in the United States. I'm off the top of my head, I can't remember the number. The numbers that are formally recognized by states and their inventories versus the estimated population, there's a big disparity between those two numbers. But there are other programs currently under the Infrastructure Act, and somebody's gonna have to help me here. And I think there is also some money under the Inflation Reduction Act to actually address orphaned wells, but that would be separate from this rulemaking.
Cool. Thank you for that. And then so you have the orphan wells, the ones you do know, but they're older, which could be called maybe grandfather wells. So this will apply that to those wells. Okay, cool. Thanks for that.
Dr. Bond, then Dr. Lonefight.
I'd actually like to hear what Dr. Lonefight says before I speak. But I wanted to just make a general comment in response to Dr. Cullen, which is that we're at a point where in order to address climate change, we need to consider sources that have not been considered before. And I think we've known that this has been coming, that once you get rid of the major polluters, you discover that you're left with a lot of small polluters that the regulatory system has not been very well set up for. And I think that some of the measures in this rule are going to be interesting and challenging to implement, but it's something that we have to do. As Dr. Allen said, this is a major fraction of the emissions. And some of these have been left alone because we simply don't know how to do it. And so there will, I probably shouldn't say this publicly, but there will probably be some missteps that we have to recover from. But we're not trying to do everything perfectly. We're trying to move forward on what matters for climate. And I think that as you inquired, we're really going to find something that haven't been explored before because they haven't been under the spotlight, and there will be environmental justice implications.
Dr. Lonefight.
Thank you. Not doctor yet, still working on it. So one of the things that I am sure that this group is not aware of, but I'm sure it'll ring some bells with some of you. When states are collecting data, they don't always include the data on the reservation, especially, let's say, when you're looking at orphan wells. They're not including that. We as tribes collect that, and I'm just speaking on behalf of my tribe because I know that's what we're doing. I direct the Science and Research Department. That's what we're doing. We're gathering that data. We have the expertise on staff. I'm a remote sensing scientist, and we have other GIS people that are helping with that. But you're going to get a skewed vision of things. And I think that that's one of the things that this group is a fabulous group of experts. But, and I do applaud that. But when we are saying the state of North Dakota, we have our tribe has a very, I will say a good working relationship with them. I won't say it's excellent, and I won't say that it is focused quite in the way when you're looking at environmental concerns as it should be. I also am an advisor to the chairman, the leader of our tribe, Chairman Mark Fox. And so I'm his advisor on those issues. And so that's my job, to stay current with them. I have seen the data that comes out of that, and we have different people from North Dakota that I respect as colleagues. However, if they're not including our data, if they're not measuring that, then they're just giving you a measurement of what they want to give you a measurement of. They're not giving you an accurate data set on the population as a whole in North Dakota, and certainly not the reservations. And so that's just something I want to add in the conversation for topic, because none of us as scientists ever want to depend on a flawed data set, something that's flawed in terms of a group of people, right? We want to be as accurate with that, and just report the facts. Well, those facts aren't always, when you're dealing with state and federal regulations, those numbers aren't always accurate. And so I just want to throw that out there, and I appreciate everybody's work. Thank you.
Well, and I don't know if Dave, I'll just respond. That's a great comment, and we'll make sure, I'll certainly look back and make sure that reference to ensuring that all facilities really means all facilities relative to tribal lands, and that they're included, because I'll have to ask some of our experts that I know, because I don't know whether they're in the numbers. I just don't know the answer. I got to talk to some of the people. Okay, you're saying they're not in the numbers. Okay, we'll make that note and make sure that's included. It's not something I'd looked at.
Okay, not seeing any more hands raised. I'm going to suggest we go back to the charge questions, looking at number 5, and then the last one, number 6. So starting with number 5. And this one, Dr. Hamburg's again going to comment on and lead the discussion up. So Steve, I'm going to turn this back to you on looking at the integration of this with emission reporting frameworks.
Right. So as was referenced earlier, the major motivation for this, well, it's a generic one, but the specific one is that in the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a provision under the methane fee. I'm going to get it wrong. Methane emissions reporting program, I think. I don't know. I'm not going to get that right. Anyway, it doesn't matter what the label is, but there's the methane fee being assessed against oil and gas associated methane emissions. And one of the provisions in it requires explicitly that the EPA by the end of 2024 update the greenhouse gas reporting program requirements to ensure that the data are accurate based on empirical data. And so this requirement is a major one. There are funds included in the bill to help augment the doing of this. And one of the things that becomes important, and we call out with this recommendation, is to ensure that in the creation of high quality collection and use of high quality data to inform emission inventories, that this regulation aligns with the requirements of the Inflation Reduction Act and any others that exist, so that we can bring as much data to ensure the greatest possible integrity and accuracy to the emission inventories, to ensure that they reflect also the work that comes out of this regulation. So one of the things that's important is that as these regulations come into effect, that the inventories reflect changing emissions, which we would very much hope are going down. Under the current system, that would be hard because they're using fixed emission factors, so they would not very well reflect changing conditions resulting from the activities that are going to be required here, or the feedbacks in the case of the methane fee that would result from companies taking actions to reduce their emissions, to reduce their fees. So this recommends that EPA really look to how to integrate these activities, because there's real synergy to be realized that will benefit both the ensuring that we get good reporting in the inventories, and also the feedback that the companies that are being regulated would certainly want if I were them, as well as the mandates, so that we can accurately understand what the emissions are. So happy to open that up. Sorry if that sounded, it's a little it's written in a way that it's a little hard to recognize potentially, but it's written because there's this larger need, and this fits into that larger context, and the need to make sure that there's a good coordination between these activities. There's a real opportunity for synergy here. Questions?
I'll just add one comment, Steve. The word periodically again appears here.
Right. And because these are going to require major efforts. And as I said, under the Inflation Reduction Act, the requirement is these changes be completed by 2024. So they're not immediate. And they don't require updates. That act does not require updates subsequent to that initial revision for 2024.
Not seeing any hands. Let's move on to charge question 6. And this deals with capacity needs. And I'll go ahead and just comment on this. As we've discussed these recommendations, you've heard about a number of areas where there's new and evolving science, new and evolving techniques. And so the work group drafted a recommendation that encourages EPA to develop coordinated efforts of multiple stakeholders supporting emission measurement and reduction, and including education for community-based organizations that might promote environmental justice objectives. And so this broadly encourages that capacity building. There's a lot of work ahead and a lot of new areas of science, and so we're recommending capacity building. Any thoughts from committee members or the board on this final charge question and recommendation in the draft report? Sylvie.
Oops, I'll lower my hand there before I forget. Thank you. I was sort of struck by both the brevity of the answer and the lack of nuance, given that they asked broadly for a response on just new human and institutional capacity. You know, I don't know if they were asking specifically, but certainly, you know, from within inside universities, I can tell you our curricula probably aren't going to meet these needs. And so, you know, I wasn't sure whether there was, you know, sort of more nuance that needed to go into what's our future workforce going to be, and do we even have that coming? And then on the institutional capacity, this perhaps goes back a little bit to the previous one, but I chose to bring it up here. And that's that, you know, there's lots of talk about multiple data sources coming online and data integration being important and being transparent and whatever, do they have the institutional, is part of this the need to develop the institutional capacity to maintain and curate and have transparent the integrated data products that go into this? So that's two questions, I guess.
Well, let me provide a little bit more context, which is we got no charge questions from the agency. So the work group did its work and envisioned its own charge questions and then came up with responses to its own charge questions. And so there's no issue of trying to determine what the agency might be asking for. We wrote the charge question really in response to the point we were trying to make, which is that there's going to be a lot of different types of capacities needed here. I think that one way we might want to go as a board, and certainly reflecting on some of the comments that have come in, is that one way to begin to build capacity would be the establishment of the standing committee that's already come up, right? And as the start of a framework for doing this, like many of these other things, I don't know that we can establish exactly what these capacities are that are needed. There are lots, and so perhaps a way to broaden this is to incorporate within it the recommendation of that I've been hearing from board members in this discussion, that we establish a standing committee. And my question back to the board, perhaps to embellish that a little bit, and then I'll turn to Steve, is would that be a standing committee of the board? Would it be a standing committee that the EPA would establish? If we were to put that as a recommendation for continuing to have capacity building, where would that reside? So Steve, you had comments?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, the postman's coming and my dogs are barking. My apologies for that. Yeah, so I think it is actually not a recommendation to EPA. It's an internal question of whether we create a committee, and maybe it's referenced that we would like to have an ongoing dialogue with them. And I'll defer to others who know to the SAB staff regarding that. But I did want to comment. I put my hand up relative to this sort of ensuring the community-based organizations. I certainly I've gotten asked many times about this by community-based organizations. The challenge is, as we talked, is a very rapidly evolving technology with increasingly sophisticated, increasing amounts of remote sensing data and diversity of data types, which can be misunderstood, not because of malice, just because they're complicated data sets. So I think the notion, as I understood the conversation in the subcommittee, was just how do we provide the support for civil society writ large to be able to use these data most effectively, and particularly in that evolving context, having that ability is something one has to do deliberately, because otherwise, one, it's a high threshold to get through for any group or any individual. And secondly, I think it risks having spurious inferences. We've certainly seen that in some of the scientific literature in this context, where some papers were published by people who didn't work with these data regularly and simply didn't interpret the remote sensing data appropriately, and it needed to be modified just simply because they didn't understand. In this case, I'm thinking of albedo backgrounds and how it affects it. All very doable and well understood, but not always obvious to somebody who wants to extract information from the data. So I think that was my interpretation, which I so wholly support, because it's so critically important to make sure this is a broad civil society. These data are available and useful to people in a lot of different contexts.
So I'll go to Dr. Bond, then Dr. Bruder, and then Dr. Cullen.
Thanks. Great question, Dr. Bruder. So I wanted to address it. it would be wonderful and yet a giant speculative task to outline the types of institutions that are needed to help us move forward. You brought forward that universities are currently not capable of this. We could have a much longer conversation about whether they will ever be capable of it, or whether that's the appropriate location for what really needs to be a community of practice. And so I think we chose to leave that ambiguous because I personally felt that it wasn't within my power to envision exactly how such a structure would come about, only that it was necessary. I would add that it's not only community organizations that need education, but also companies, and especially small companies that want to be on top of what they might be tasked with doing. And so it's beyond me to say whether that should live within the EPA. My personal feeling again is that it probably should not, because ownership should devolve to the people who are most effective, and some kind of professional society might be a more appropriate home. But we chose to leave that really open. I recognize that we did not answer all the questions, and we probably raised more than we really answered. But I do recognize that those issues are out there and that they're going to have to be grappled with.
I guess I like the notion of, but again, I don't know where it ought to be, but this, I mean, these are sort of where to educate and about what to educate is a huge challenge in many sectors right now. And, bringing, whether it's private or community-based organizations up to speed on how to deal with the influx of data that we feel they ought to be able to deal with. But it seems like from that perspective, there ought to be some way of wording this that recognizes that the capacities are far different, and the requirements are hard to predict, much the way you just stated it. But will be critical to the success, and therefore there needs to be some sort of mechanism that, is, rather than us just sort of throwing our hands up in the air and saying everybody needs to be talked to and brought to the table, does some sort of prioritization of, can we find critical, what's the low hanging fruit? What's the most important need? Can we set up some sort of working group that has the authority to recommend and to bring in? And because if you're going to wait, as a recent past president of a professional society, if you're going to wait for a professional society to do much, I can weigh in on the likelihood of that as well. So just on their own, without strong encouragement. So I just wondering if there is, wondering aloud, a better way to succinctly state the challenge, the opportunity, and the uncertainty, but the need to proceed and the need to be looking for the things that must be done as fast as possible.
Dr. Cullen.
I feel like I should yield to the others on the work group. We're hearing about multiple different things here. So some of them fall into SAB because it's about the scientific and technical underpinnings of regulation, which is certainly our area. And then some of them fall within, EPA does have a number of educational and community engagement activities that we could look at, or they could look at and think about whether those serve any part of this, whether this is completely distinct. And then there's things even beyond that. So I feel like I should wait. Shakovi's still waiting, and Dr. Guckenheimer. I'll wait until the end.
Okay. Dr. Wilson.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for that. I just wanted to chime in about, my contribution in thinking about it. In my work, I do a lot of work that's in general about capacity building. And so from a community science standpoint, as a former member of the National Environmental Advisory Council, we talked a lot about, community science has been a part of how they eat, again, that representative justice, community's voice, like that building their capacity to be able to do this kind of work, whether it be methane or air quality monitoring. Those R grants that just came out, in November, over 100, I'm not sure the number, but that's an example of a current EPA program where you're trying to build community capacity to do air quality monitoring. I'm not sure how many submissions focused on greenhouse gases and methane, but that's definitely in the realm of our discussion right now, right? If there are, measure methane, other GHGs and co-pollutants, right? So that you already have a federal program that kind of gives you that kind of space to help build capacity, have the QA/QC. So my contribution is really just bringing that focus into this work. And since the EPA is focused more to expand from a diversity, equity, inclusion perspective, what science is counted, what science is valued, and making sure, again, it is high quality, reproducible, all those words that we like to use when it comes to QA/QC. And then one last point, I think I do like the idea of understanding, the different types of sectors and stakeholder groups who would need to be engaged in this. And I think, there's some other, beyond SAB, there's some other federal agencies that talk about technology, they talk about data integration, data sharing, that we may want to think about. I'm not sure how we would do it in report, but just acknowledge that there are other advisory councils, there's other factors who focus on data, right? Beyond what we're talking about here. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Dr. Gockenheimer.
My experience has been that we tend to generally give insufficient attention to data collection, curation, and dissemination. That in our last meeting, one of the questions that we were asked were related to the fact that there are several different systems for trying to identify which communities deserve special treatment or are identified with regard to issues involving environmental justice. And my impression is that universities tend not to be very good organizations for conducting these sorts of activities, because the time scale that's involved is very long. That unless there is sort of support from endowments and things of that sort, placing data centers in universities places upon them a burden to continue to get funding from outside sources that is often difficult to achieve. So there are general issues that are involved here in this particular thing that I think are broader than the specific questions that we're concerning with regard to community action. But I think that the Scientific Advisory Board could perhaps play a useful role for the EPA in encouraging the EPA to take a more sustained look at the way in which data collection and curation is done relative to the EPA activities. That's it.
Thank you. I see Dr. Elion has her hand up.
And I don't know, Dr. Cullen, if I'm jumping in ahead of you, if you'd like to go, please let me know.
No, I think I appreciate the comments. So I think this is a good, continue, please.
So I would just wanted to continue on the same topic of, the charge question seems focused on the human and institutional capacity. And to Dr. Bond's comment that it was, the statement was relatively vague on purpose, and who knows where the training should occur, EPA, universities, and it's probably not really necessary in this document to have that specified. But I would say when I read the bolded document, reading it made me think that the educational need was for the community-based organizations and less so for other groups. And so I guess what I might suggest is that on line 21, where the SAB recommends that the EPA encourage, I might suggest that it read more like that the EPA encourages training and capacity building, because it's for not just the community base, but for the first part of the sentence I read as being for other professionals or whatever, whatever group that might be, as a way to really state that everybody needs that kind of increased knowledge base and not just community-based people. So that's just a suggestion of some type of wording that might go in there.
Thank you. So that concludes the work group's presentation of the report and its recommendations. Dr. Cullen, I'm going to turn the leadership of the meeting back to you.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Allen, and all the work group members for this particular report. It's such a tremendous lift, and all the comments from the SAB members. I think it's laudable. You posed really interesting and important charge questions. You answered them. We have a lot to work with here. I wanted to also ask for comments from SAB members on any changes or additions that we need to the preamble or the summary of recommendations. And that could include the letter to the administrator. And some of the things that we've been hearing about might fit well into getting a little more of the spotlight here, including the idea that there could be a need for a standing committee, especially that would fall into SAB's bailiwick if it were looking at scientific and technical underpinning, which I think is what we were talking about for that. But also, the fact that there's been a little bit of a departure, EPA on social cost of carbon. So there's now an EPA statement on social cost of greenhouse gas that's separate from the interagency work group statement on social cost of carbon. And so that's something that a number of people have expressed an interest potentially in looking at, and that could be an activity of the board. I see Richard's got his hand up too. Dr. Smith, did you want to add something on the preamble or the recommendations or the letter to the administrator or something to highlight?
Thanks, Alison. I just want to make a very general comment, which is something I've said before at these meetings, but I think under the previous administration, I think when we sent reports to the administrator, there was a tendency to use the cover letter to summarize the main points of the report. And I mean the main scientific points, not just an overview of what the purpose of the report is. And I don't know how the members of this work group feel about that, but I would sort of encourage that if you felt up to the task, that maybe expand the cover letter and try to include some summary of what the report's actually saying. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. And I'm very open to members of the work group jumping in. I would say that summary of recommendations, I mean, there are quite a few recommendations for this report. And so there's a 2-page summary of recommendations. I'm guessing that that's not part of the letter because then the letter gets very long and the letter can point to the summary, but reasonable minds may differ on whether those points should go directly into the letter. Dr. Allen, you turned your screen on. Why don't I take your comment first, and then let's see, Lisa Lone fights up, and then Richard Smith, if you wanted to come. Oh, you're off. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Allen.
So I would endorse the idea of elevating to the cover letter to the administrator the idea of having a standing committee to look at some of the issues raised for periodic evaluation. And perhaps in response to Dr. Smith's comment, just to comment very briefly in the cover letter about the general areas. We highlighted those 6 general areas, and we might highlight that in the cover letter as well. And so I would certainly endorse that as an improvement to the overall report.
Thank you. Let's see, Lisa and then Steve.
So EPA has a government-to-government relationship with federally recognized tribes. And I'm never sure quite where to add this comment, but I think it's so important. I think we need to foreground that when we have these conversations. So we're talking about universities and different entities. Remember, we do have that relationship, and that is that is unique. And that's where we end up saying, let's get the North Dakota data. We have a different relationship. And I think that that's something that it's a lens that we need to view certain maybe states that have those federally recognized tribes within them. Thank you.
Thanks. Would you like something in the preamble or in the recommendations related to that? Or as a more general, this is something that we should be keeping our eyes on, frankly, throughout all of the regulations that we're looking at?
So what I'm finding is when we have those conversations with we have a lot of good conversations and good relationships. Certainly Chairman Fox is very good at that with our state of North Dakota leaders. Not saying anything disparaging in terms of that. However, not everybody sees things in a certain way, and that's where data becomes skewed. And I think that that's just an important lens that needs to be acknowledged formally. So people reading this will say, oh, we'll do this because, believe it or not, that's happening right now with some of the stuff, recommendations EPA is making. They are saying, oh, we have some tribes here, so we're going to apply for this money and let's try and get a tribal member, put them on this committee, and voila, we have it. The tribe, we're working with the tribes because Joe such and such is on here. No, he doesn't have a technical background. No, he doesn't work with the tribe, but he's willing to come over to Bismarck every so often and meet with us. So that's awesome. And it's just another way when we look at these justice issues, we really have to take a look at that. And we're having these conversations when Chairman Fox is serving on a different committee for the former administrator. We included that throughout the document that they had published because they would say federal or state, tribal, federal, they didn't just put us in there as under federal are all these different nations. To say tribal, it was really important, so people kept that in their mind, like, oh, okay, so they're going to probably do their own projects. What capacity do they have? And I know that there aren't a lot of tribes that are us. We have many environmental issues, concerns going on, and we are monitoring them so carefully. And there are other tribes that don't have those things going on and don't have the capacity. So they rely on EPA in a different way. And I'm just saying, I think that that's a really important part to this conversation that we need to pay attention to. But thank you.
Thanks. And I can see a few places where in this particular case, we can pull in and including on charge question 6, if you think it would be appropriate, where we're talking about communities and we're talking about multiple stakeholders. I think we can be a little more inclusive there. There may be some other places as well. I know Steve Hamburg reflected earlier some ideas on that. So I think that's a great comment. I'll turn to you, Steve.
Great. So I want to endorse what Dr. Allen said relative to the cover, including the standing committee, but maybe with what I think is a friendly amendment. I think, and again, as I mentioned earlier, I want to ask the SAB office, but we have the prerogative to create a standing subcommittee. I don't think we need to have permission. I think rather what we're requesting is we would appreciate and think it would be productive to have a working relationship where there was an ongoing effort because of these many issues that are dynamic. So really looking at it as a more dynamic rather than we want to watch what you're doing, but we want to collaborate with you. And I think that would be a really constructive way to frame it. I also am, while I agree that I think it's good to include some kind of summary, I am a little bit nervous about making that, to Dr. Smith's point, of making, other than a general sort of very brief categorization of what we did, making it a long rehashing in the cover letter, because I think it's going to be too much. It'll be hard to do that in 2 paragraphs. It'll be way longer. So I think we have to be minimalist in that regard.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think having the pointer in the cover letter and, as you say, spotlighting there, but then pointing to the 2 pages of incredibly complex and rich recommendations. So that's great. And it looks like Tom Brennan might be ready to address the structural aspects of standing committees and other things. So please, thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just keep it brief and say that you should be confident in pursuing this recommendation if that's what you want to do. That myself and the staff office will work behind this meeting to put a structure together. And it sounds like it's a possibility of a standing committee and then also some negotiations with the agency about how that committee would add value. And I'm willing to help on both.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. We really we rely on you for so many things, and this is a great example. So thank you. Another piece I don't want to lose here, and I think it's slightly separate. It sounds like there's maybe some interest in getting a briefing. We'd like to hear a bit about the process where, there's been contractor review. This is on the sort of a little bit of a departure from the interagency work group on social cost of carbon, this EPA statement on greenhouse gas social cost. So maybe getting a little bit of a briefing to the SAB on that, or am I imagining that I'm hearing some interest in that? It sounded like perhaps there are some folks that would like that. And that seems like a great way for us, we interested in finding out what's going on. We know that our part is certainly the scientific and technical underpinning. So we, are cognizant that there's lots of aspects to this, lots of trade-offs and things that don't necessarily involve us, but yeah, I think that I'm getting a little bit of support for that interest, maybe a little bit more support. Yeah, so I think that's another piece too. Dr. Allen, you'd like to add something?
Certainly support that, but I would hope that we could support that request, but separate it from the review of this rule.
Yes, I agree. I think this is something, usually it's rare that you check the box and you're done with an issue forever, right? I mean, these things come back around again, and we know that that's one that's overarching and doesn't just involve this particular action. Thanks, Dr. Olmsted.
I would also just request that for that one, EPA does right now have its own estimate, but more generally, right, the goal is to have the single estimate for the whole federal government from the IWG, which has its own process and is responding currently in the development of the new estimates to an NAS study, right, which will probably be reconsidered by NAS. So where we fit in is not super clear to me. And so I think it's just making sure that we phrase it in a way, that, can we understand this is sort of part of an overarching federal government process that's well beyond SAB's, scope, but because EPA right now has its own, has its own estimate, that's, I think, really the limit of our interest.
No, agree 100%. And I think this is kind of a briefing. It's for informational purposes, and it's great for us to understand what's going on so that we can see where our piece of it is and where it's not. So yeah, I appreciate that very much. Let's see, we have Dr. Schindel, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I might have missed this detail, but for the standing committee that we're talking about, what I remember hearing was that came up when we were talking about advances in measurement technology and such. And I think that makes a lot of sense, and just wanted to suggest that we also could consider this, having language in there about possible areas the standing committee could interact with the EPA would also include the certification process and some of our recommendations around things like expanding emission measurements beyond methane to hazardous air pollutants as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Very helpful. All right. I don't see other hands, and this would probably be a good point to really kind of bring it to closure. I think we've got the comments. We've talked about a bit about the letter and the preamble. So I think at this point, I would call for a motion to approve the work group's report. We've had a number of changes that we've discussed, and if there's a motion and a second,
I'd be happy to make a motion to accept the committee's report subject to the modifications as discussed in today's meeting, with the request that be approved subject to approval of the revisions from the work group chair and the chair of the SAB.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
I'll a second.
Second.
All right. Any discussion before we bring that to a vote? All right. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, the motion carries. So again, really appreciating the work group and the report and all of your contributions to that, and also the additions today. I think this might be a good time for us to take a 10-minute break. We've been on here for quite a while, so let's see, it's 11:35, so maybe we, or at least on the West Coast, and so maybe we return at 11:45 West Coast, which is what, 2:45 East Coast? Okay, let's take 10 minutes.
Good. Monday still. Come on.
All right, let's come back together again. Welcome back. All right, let's turn to our next agenda item. We're going to discuss the recommendations received from the SAB work group for review of science supporting EPA decisions. And I'll briefly review the responsibilities of this work group, review for most of you. The SAB is required by law to receive information from EPA about the science supporting planned regulatory actions when those actions are provided to any other federal agency for formal comment and review. The board may decide to review the adequacy of the scientific and technical basis of the planned regulatory actions at that point. So the SAB work group plays an important role in this process. It makes recommendations to the full SAB about whether there's a need to review the science supporting those planned regulatory actions. The SAB work group for the review of science supporting EPA decisions, mouthful, was formed in November of 2021. The work group consists of myself as chair, Dr. David Allen, Dr. Barbara Beck, Dr. Jay Chakraborty, Dr. Stephen Hamburg, Dr. Celine Hernandez-Ruiz, Dr. Sheila Olmsted, Dr. Christy Pullen-Fednick, Dr. Amanda Rodewald, Dr. Jonathan Samet, Dr. Peter Thorne, and Dr. June Weintraub. And I hope I didn't miss anyone. We sometimes have a member coming on or off for various reasons. I think I've got you all though. Work group met on October 27th of last year and also December 12th and developed recommendations concerning SAB review of science supporting 6 EPA planned regulatory actions. I'll state what those are and then we'll go through them one by one. The first one is PFAS, National Primary Drinking Water Regulation Rulemaking. It's RIN 2040 AG 18. Second one is volume requirements for 2023 and beyond under the Renewable Fuel Standard Program. That's RIN 2060 AV 14. Third is NESHAPs and New Source Performance Standards for the synthetic organic chemical manufacturing industry and other certain equipment leak processes. That's RIN 2060 AV 71. The fourth one is PFAS related designations as CERCLA hazardous substances. It's RIN 2050 AH 25. Fifth, regulation of methylene chloride under Section 6A of the TSCA. That's RIN 2070 AK 70. And sixth and final, request from states for removal of gasoline volatility waiver. That's RIN 2060 AV 73. My memorandum to the board, which was dated January 5th, 2023, documents the work group's recommendations and provides some background information on these actions. The work group found that one of the 6 planned actions considered warrants further review by the SAB, and that action is RIN 2060 AV 14, the proposed rule titled Volume Requirements for 2023 and Beyond under the Renewable Fuel Standard Program. Let's see. So the board will now discuss these recommendations, reach agreement on any actions that we would like to pursue. And before we do that, I would just ask board members if there are any questions about the process. All right, it looks like we're all set. So the first action, again, this is the PFAS National Primary Drinking Water Regulation Rulemaking. With this action, EPA intends to develop a proposed national primary drinking water regulation for PFOA and PFOS, and as appropriate, take final action. Additionally, EPA will continue to consider other PFAS as part of this issue and action. The action provides a key commitment in EPA's PFAS strategic roadmap, EPA's commitments to action 2021 through 2024. The agency is still working on this regulation and the proposed rule has not yet been published. We did receive some deliberative information about the rule, which has not been finalized yet, as mentioned, so that's subject to change, so we won't discuss that. But the EPA held public meetings to review 4 key documents supporting the rule. The first was EPA's proposed approaches to the derivation of a draft maximum contaminant level goal for perfluorooctanoic acid, PFOA, in drinking water. Second was EPA's proposed approaches to the derivation of a draft maximum contaminant level goal for PFOS, perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, in drinking water. Third was EPA's framework for estimating non-cancer health risks associated with mixtures of PFAS. And fourth was EPA's analysis of cardiovascular disease risk reduction as a result of reduced PFOA and PFAS exposure in drinking water. In the review of the documents, the SAB agreed with EPA's proposed designation of PFOA as a likely carcinogen. This would typically mean that a maximum contaminant level goal of the MCLG would be set to 0. We know that EPA has published updated drinking water health advisories of 0.02 parts per trillion for PFAS and 0.004 parts per trillion for PFOA. And in addition, we know that EPA has indicated that the minimum quantitation level for PFAS and PFOA is 4 ppt, and EPA's health advisories for PFOA and PFAS are both below the level of detection and quantitation. The SAB work group found that this planned action does not warrant further review by the SAB because SAB did conduct similar scientific peer review of key analyses supporting the rule. However, the work group recommended that the SAB indicate that the agency's charge to the SAB for the review of the science supporting the PFAS rule was somewhat narrow. It didn't include all aspects of the benefits assessment. So we wanted to note that in further reviews of EPA work products supporting agency regulatory actions, the scope of the charge question should be carefully considered and developed. So I would like to call for a discussion and a motion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation of no further review for this action. Is there any discussion on this one? And certainly work group members are welcome to chime in if I've left out anything. All right, so is there a motion to approve then the work group's recommendation of, oh, we've got Dr. LeChevalier, go ahead. I think you might be on mute. I think you're on mute. Go try again.
Sorry, I have a
Oh, there you
double
go.
mute.
That's okay. Thank you.
Although the SAB did review the health effects and the health advisory and had serious concerns around and comments around that, you know, there's no, we don't know necessarily how EPA responded or has revised that. And so given that that is a cornerstone to the rest of the rule, just because we've reviewed it and had serious concerns, is it appropriate that we still leave this open? So we look at how EPA responded to those comments and more importantly, how those health effects then drive the rest of the rulemaking. So is it, I guess my question is it premature to say, well, just because we looked at it, there's nothing more to say?
Yeah, so you're wondering if we should in some way leave this one open and not come to a decision right now. I don't know when our next decision step might be, but we could in the interim look at what's been transpiring. That's possible. Dr. Bond, you might want to add something on that. Dr. Bond, did you have your hand up? Let's see. Oh, Dr. Post. Okay, thank you.
A minor comment that was different than Dr. LeChevalier, so I was going to wait until his comment was finished being discussed.
Yeah, or do others have thoughts about this in terms of leaving this open until we are able to sort of follow what has transpired?
Well, EPA, I think you said it, but I've been following, what they've been saying in different webinars, has stated multiple times that they're making major revisions in response to the SAB's comments. So do we normally re-review things that once EPA has responded to our comments, and it's, from what I understand, I don't have no knowledge of what is in the revision, but they're making a lot of revisions in response to the SAB report.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a gray area. Some things come back around fairly quickly because there's more than one action that relies on some particular piece of science, or sometimes we leave something open or we revisit it. I mean, it's really an open area, how we track and follow up on what happens with our comments. And I think it's a great question to raise.
I think that Dr. Chu may remember better than I do because he chaired that work group, but I think it was discussed whether we would ask to see it again because so many revisions were being recommended, and it was, at least in the PFAS work group, it was this, and the report was, finalized by the chartered SAB. It was decided not to make that recommendation at that time.
Dr. Chu, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't specifically ask, I think, for them to send it back to us again. But I guess, I'm new to the overall SAB, so I'm not totally clear in terms of rulemakings, like where the SAB typically is, what their SAB's typical role is in these type of rulemakings. Or is it, so they sent us their, scientific documents, which admittedly were not fully complete. Actually, some of the mechanistic data hadn't been, sent to us to review, and we did make a lot of recommendations for change. But of course, rulemakings proceed on their own schedule as well, and there is, will be, the usual rulemaking process, the public comment and things like that. But I guess I'm a little fuzzy on the role of the SAB in general in terms of these type of rulemakings.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give a start at that answer, and others may want to add as well. That was a different action, right? This is now another action that also involves some of the same documents. So we're kind of talking about two different things right now, but that's fine. When an action is at that stage, either it's being sent to OMB or an earlier stage, if one of the program offices reaches out to us, we review decide if we want to review the scientific and technical basis, and then as a whole, the board votes on that, and then we proceed with that. There are a lot of things that go into rulemaking besides the scientific and technical basis. So although we weigh in on that, we always acknowledge that EPA is undertaking policymaking and that there are trade-offs in policymaking that are beyond what we would weigh in on. So that's sort of the other part of it. But, in terms of bringing things back to us, the times I've seen that we've weighed in multiple times has been where something else relies on the same information. And that is the case that we're in right now. I think that's why Dr. Chevalier, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like, okay, so there, there's a related rule in a related area. Yeah. Other thoughts or comments on how we might want to proceed? I mean, we could decide to do something on this particular action as a way to do follow-up. I'm not sure that's really getting at what you're raising, though. I'm not sure that's what you're proposing, but don't let me put words in your mouth.
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily proposing it, because I know that the regulatory rulemaking process has a ton of review steps already in it. And, people, us as individuals or other stakeholders will all get a chance to provide public comments and on any particular rulemaking when it actually goes out for proposal. So
I believe, but someone from the Office of Water is on the call, that there's a legal regulatory time frame deadlines for this under the Safe Drinking Water Act for MCLs or drinking water standards from when it's proposed to when it has to be adopted to. I'm quite sure, but somebody needs from EPA can confirm that's true. It's a certain, I think, by March, from when they made the regulatory decision, I think they have until March of this year to propose it. But then I think there's also another deadline when it needs to be adopted. So the SAB process can take a while. Maybe someone from EPA would know the details about the deadlines, the time.
Yeah, thank you. Certainly open to someone from EPA answering the timeline question. And I'll just reflect, I mean, Dr. Post is right. It's usually for us, the strongest statements that we can make are the ones that we make in that earlier step, whether or not EPA picks them up or however they decide to respond to them, because it's early enough in the process. But anyone from EPA want to weigh in on
I can speak to that, Dr. Cullen, if you'd like me to. Eric Bernison from EPA's Office of Groundwater Drinking Water. I first want to thank the SAB for the extensive recommendations you provided to us this past summer on the 4 documents that were key and instrumental to the agency's development of the proposed rulemaking. And I want to clarify that we sought the recommendations in advance of the proposed rulemaking, in part so the SAB would have the time needed to make the deliberations, and because the Safe Drinking Water Act actually requires that we seek those recommendations prior to the proposal. Gloria is once again correct about the fact that we are operating under a time frame, and the time frame that she's recalling is that we have to propose a rule 24 months after we make a positive reg determination. That's March 3rd. Is that statutory time frame. Then we have to promulgate the final rule within 18 months of that proposal. So we are operating under statutory deadlines, and as others have indicated, we have given significant consideration to the SAB's recommendations and incorporated them into the proposal, which is still undergoing interagency review at this point in time, but we hope to be proposing it very soon.
Thank you. So others on the board or Dr. Le Chevalier, thoughts about how we might like to proceed?
Well, I mean, it sounds more like, rather than, since we already have given, review of supporting science, is that the time frame of this, of the process actually prohibits us from, or it makes it impractical that anything that we would do would influence before the proposal. And I think, as is mentioned, we all can make comments once the rule is proposed. So, maybe just because we've looked at it and, we've already made comments rather than is one justification, but, maybe the other is that the time frame kind of precludes, ability for SAB to make any significant accent.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
didn't mean to cut you off. My internet's a little bumpy.
Yeah, I think probably the more significant reason is that the timeline now, kind of precludes the opportunity for significant input.
So we did have quite a bit of input in that earlier round, and EPA reached out to us, and we did review the 4 documents, and so that was a way to be early enough in the timeline. And it's true that now things have moved to a different state, and it does take a while. It takes a while to form a panel and do those reviews, and then the full board, reviews the work of the panel and so forth. We've gone through all those steps. So you're correct. But there are other opportunities for input. But, I don't think we should come away feeling that we haven't had a chance for input. We did have input earlier on. I think that the thing that's hard is if you have a chance for input early on, you don't always have all the materials in front of you because it is early on. And so there's a trade-off there that I think it's painful for lots of us, right? Because we'd like to have everything in front of us and be able to review everything. And yet it is the case that when you get in early, your comments can have more impact in a sense, but you also don't always have everything in front of you. I'll just be frank. So I think if that's what I'm hearing, I completely understand where you're coming from. Dr.
Well,
Greenwald?
I was impressed, and so some comments I got from members of the community around the SAB review of that. I pointed out, I think it was, I forget, more than 106 pages of comments, and some very significant levels of concern. So to the members of the community, I said SAB did provide very serious concerns. How that actually gets handled, how does that get rolled into the final rule? I guess we'll find out on March 4th. Whether or not all the scientific issues have been, adequately addressed, given the significant concerns that the SAB report raised. I mean, anyway, significant issue, remains to be seen, and I guess those will come out in comments, and maybe the window for our opportunity has passed. And so I guess rather than saying, we looked at everything and everything's hunky-dory, to say we looked at it, we put comments, and maybe the window for anything more is really outside of the opportunity SAB, and unless we have an opportunity to kind of hold up that schedule, for demanding an additional scientific review. I don't know if that's in our.
Well, two separate things. I mean, one is we don't per se hold up the schedule. On the other hand, we have sometimes reviewed things very late in the process just because we do have something that we feel that we want to say. I mean, in this case, I think the thing that we're saying probably the most strongly at the moment is just that the charge was somewhat narrow, right? It didn't include all the aspects of the benefits assessment. And so that is a continuing comment that we make. Dr. Post.
I just wanted to clarify what Dr. Le Chevalier said, that even though there were a lot of comments about like how for the health effects part, I'm talking, not the benefit. The SAB did agree with many of the basic fundamental conclusions that are different than what EPA's previous conclusions about these chemicals were as far as health effects and risk assessment, even though there were a lot of specific comments about improving like the presentation and certain aspects. The SAB agreed with some you mentioned about it, PFOA being a likely carcinogen, I think, and all that's a change that the SAB support didn't disagree with, and also the use of human epidemiology data as the basis rather than animal data, which is a major change. The SAB did support a lot of what EPA was doing. I just, in case people listening in aren't familiar, I just wanted to make that point.
Thanks. I appreciate that. So the work group had, a similar conversation in some ways. There are some realities here, but in the end, we are recommending that that this action doesn't warrant further review. We feel that we, did have some chances to weigh in. Oh, Dr. Hsu, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was actually just gonna, propose to, what is it, the second or have a motion to agree with the work group's determination. And one reason is from a practical point of view, given that we agreed that PFOA was likely carcinogen and the MCLG would be 0, the actual regulatory level for anything with MCLG 0 will be practically based, right? Technology, analytical. It won't be a health-based standard because the MCLG is 0. And then any treatment of PFOA, I think, also treats PFAS. So, the actual impact of a further review in terms of its practical impact on the final rule might be marginal, I guess, given those two aspects. So in that sense, I'm sort of comfortable letting it move forward, despite the number of comments that we had in terms of helping them to improve their document.
Thanks for
I appreciate that discussion, and I'm okay with that kind of a logic and moving forward.
Thanks. So thanks for the motion to approve or disapprove the work group. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
Second.
Okay, thanks. So the work group found that the planned action doesn't warrant further review, but we do make the comment about the narrowness of the scope in the first instance that we had the chance. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, well, I thank you. And I thank you for the discussion, and I think we'll keep having some of these discussions. So I do appreciate that. So the second planned action that we'll discuss is the volume requirements for 2023 and beyond under the Renewable Fuel Standard, and that's RIN 2060 AV14. So this is under Section 211.0 of the Clean Air Act. The EPA is required to determine applicable volume requirements for the Renewable Fuel Standard for the years after those specified in the statute. And this action proposes the applicable volumes and percentage standards for 2023 through 2025 for cellulosic biofuel, biomass-based diesel, advanced biofuel, and total renewable fuel. There are several other regulatory changes in the program that were also proposed. So further, to develop the volume requirements for the renewable fuel standard, EPA has indicated that it's relying on existing studies and analyses and or building on those conducted for previous renewable standard setting rulemakings and related actions. And one aspect of this is an assessment of the potential greenhouse gas impacts of certain biofuels. EPA indicated that the proposed rule, it appears 87 FR 8582, if you want to look it up, relies on estimates from peer-reviewed literature, peer-reviewed models and analyses published in support of government programs. This includes estimates from CARB, the California Air Resources Board, in support of the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard. EPA indicated that the updated biofuel greenhouse gas assessment applied models that have been used to publish numerous peer-reviewed journal articles on biofuels, climate change, ag policy, and some other topics too. And for the rulemaking, EPA also compared the required volumes of renewable fuels to those that would be used in the absence of the rule. The agency conducted an independent peer review for the portion of the analysis used to determine the volumes from corn ethanol for the no RFS baseline. The work group found that the adequacy of the science and technical basis supporting the requirements for renewable fuel standards is very complex, and it's an important issue. And so we came down that it should be reviewed by the chartered SAB. The work group recommended that the chartered SAB take the approach of developing a commentary on the proposed rule. That's one of the things that we can do, is we can write these commentaries to pull together our ideas and thoughts and contributions on a topic. So I'd like to call for any discussion and ultimately a motion to either approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation that we develop a commentary on the science supporting the proposed rule. And I'll also turn first to work group members if there's anyone from the work group who want. I know we had a number of people weighing in during our discussion in that group before bringing the action here. Sheila?
Yeah, thanks so much, Allison. I just wanted to mention too that part of our reasoning for going with a commentary rather, is the rapid, kind of time frame of the rule and the fact that this is governing 2023, right, this year and beyond. So they're already behind in the sense that doing a kind of full review where everything is going to get incorporated into the rulemaking seemed unlikely to us, but yeah, it was of enough importance that we felt like we wanted to weigh in this alternative manner.
Thank you for that additional. And, the commentaries are also published by SAB. They're available to all to read, and we certainly, it's a great tool for us. So other comments or thoughts? I would then ask for a motion for a vote to approve or disapprove of this recommendation.
I make a motion to approve.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thanks. So this is a motion to approve the work group's recommendation that SAB develop a commentary on the science supporting this proposed rule. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? And any abstentions? All right, thank you. Oh, sorry, I think we have a comment. Dr. Rossi.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Dr. Cullen. I just was wondering, in the table that's on page, whatever, the last page of the document that we got, it says for this one, SAB review of the supporting science is warranted. That's what it says in table 1. And I think maybe that should be modified to say a commentary is planned.
Oh,
Sorry,
I see.
Yeah.
No, that's fine. I mean, there's multiple ways that we can review the science. And so the commentary is one of them, but maybe you're asking that something more specific be said on future tables where we're trying to,
Yeah.
taken.
I was confused when I was reviewing the materials and I got very confused. And then I finally figured out that it was a commentary. So maybe a parenthesis or something.
Yeah, point taken. Thank you. It's a good point. Yeah, there are multiple ways that we review. So appreciate that. All right, let's see. Our third action is the NESHAPs and new source performance standards for synthetic organic chemical manufacturing industry and other certain equipment leak processes. That's RIN 2060 AV 71. And I'll just ask, is my audio okay? I know it's been bumpy through the day. Okay, I'm getting a couple nods. Thank you. It's bumpy to me when I hear myself. Let's see. So RIN 2060 AV 71. This is a regulation developed for the Clean Air Act mandated periodic review of the NESHAPs and new source performance standards that regulate hazardous air pollutants and VOC emissions at synthetic organic chemical manufacturing industry facilities. This rule establishes the maximum achievable control technology standard, MACT, for the controlling emissions of the HAPs from process vents, storage vessels, transfer operations, heat exchange systems, wastewater streams, and equipment leaks. The hazardous air pollutants emitted from these emission sources include, but are not limited to, ethylene oxide, benzene, 1,3-butadiene, vinyl chloride, ethylene dichloride, methanol, hexane, toluene, xylenes, and chloroprene. The agency plans to conduct a risk assessment to consider risks from the synthetic organic.
Anyway, I saw.
Oh, sorry. Could someone mute?
On the
Here, I can probably
statement
do it.
that I just.
Hold on. Let's see if we can mute. Oh, thank you. Let's see. So they're planning to conduct a risk assessment to consider risks from the synthetic organic chemical manufacturing industry source category during its technology review. This would be to ensure that the hazardous organic NESHAP standards continue to provide an ample margin of safety to protect public health. EPA also committed to conducting a risk assessment for this action, given that the last residual risk review was conducted in 2006. EPA indicated that the risk assessment is being conducted in the same manner as any residual risk review that EPA would conduct for its national emission standards for HAP under the Clean Air Act Section 112, that's F2. So the SAB work group found that the planned action does not warrant further review because it doesn't involve any new scientific approaches that require peer review. Any discussion of this action? That was a bit of a lengthy background. All right, well then I would ask for a motion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation, which is that no further review is warranted. Is there a motion?
To approve.
Any second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? Thanks. All right, well, we're halfway through the 6th, so we're heading into the 4th one now. So this planned action is titled PFAS related designations as CERCLA hazardous substances. It's RIN 2050 AH 25. This planned action is a rulemaking to designate PFAS related chemicals as hazardous substances under CERCLA. EPA is planning to issue an advance notice of proposed rulemaking to seek public input on the proposed action. Let's see. EPA already proposed a rule, RIN 2050 AH09, designated PFOA and PFOS as CERCLA hazardous substances. The SAB work group found that the PFOA and PFOS rule did not warrant further review by the SAB because no new scientific work was initiated as part of that regulatory action development, and the chartered SAB agreed with the work group in July last year, 2022. So the work group in this round found that the planned action does not warrant further review by the chartered SAB because SAB has conducted a scientific peer review of key analyses supporting assessment of the toxicity of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and no new scientific work was initiated as part of this regulatory action. Do we have discussion of this with the group, or are we moving to the motion? I see no hands up for discussion. Is there a motion to approve the work group's recommendation of no further review warranted?
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thanks. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, thank you. So 5th out of 6, the next one is titled Regulation of Methylene Chloride under Section 6A of TSCA. That's RIN 2070 AK 70. The TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act, requires EPA to address unreasonable risks of injury to health or the environment that the administrator has determined are presented by a chemical substance under the conditions of use. So following a risk evaluation for methylene chloride carried out under the authority of TSCA Section 6, EPA initiated a rulemaking to address unreasonable risks of injury to health identified in the final risk evaluation. The EPA held a public meeting of the TSCA Science Advisory Committee on Chemicals, that's the SAC, on December 3rd and 4th in 2019 to review the draft risk evaluation for methylene chloride and the supporting documents. The TSCA SAC final report was released on March 2nd, 2020. Gives us all a sense of how long some of these things take. So we are grateful to them for their work. The SAB work group found that this planned action does not warrant review of the supporting science by the chartered SAB because scientific peer review was completed by the EPA SAC, the Science Advisory Committee on Chemicals. We defer to them in this case. Any discussion of this action? All right, is there a motion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation of no further review warranted?
Motion to approve.
Thank you. A second? Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, thank you. So we're on our final, 6th and final action. The last one is titled Request from States for Removal of Gasoline Volatility Waiver. This is RIN 2060 AV 73. So this one came from governors. Pursuant to provisions specified by the Clean Air Act, governors of 7 states submitted petitions requesting that EPA remove the 1 pound per square inch reed vapor pressure waiver for summer gasoline ethanol blended fuels containing 10% ethanol. So those are the E10. Beginning with the summer of 2023, wow, which is coming up. This action is in response to their petition. EPA also received numerous petitions from stakeholders requesting an extension of the effective date to the summer of 2024. So this action also proposes a regulatory process by which states may request to reinstate the 1 PSI waiver. The work group looked at this one. We found that the action does not warrant further review by the chartered SAB because the action addresses a localized removal of a waiver. So I would now call for any discussion of this action or for a motion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation of no further review warranted. Is there discussion? All right, is there a motion to approve the work group's recommendation of no further review?
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, those were our 6 actions. So thank you for your attention on those. And I know it's a little bit of a roll call, but I appreciate it. So we now have time on the agenda to hear any brief clarifying comments from EPA and members of the public. And I would like to ask our DFO, Tom Armitage, whether any requests to speak have been received during this meeting.
No, we have not received any requests.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move to our closing remarks then, and we are finishing ahead of schedule. So I'm sure everyone will appreciate getting some of their day back. You've been very efficient. I want to really thank so much because I know how much time goes into this. And for a lot of people, this is the beginning of winter quarter or coming after the holidays when folks are catching up on things. So really thank the members of the chartered SAB for participation in a really productive meeting. I also really appreciate the SAB staff office so profoundly. They support everything we do, and also appreciate EPA staff and also liaisons for attending and helping us. And I will, for next steps, work with Tom Armitage, our DFO, to incorporate the changes that we've discussed into the SAB report on the EPA proposed oil and gas rule. So if you were vocal in those conversations and were suggesting lines and pages and suggested text, please be in touch with Tom Armitage, or he may be in touch with you. We'll ask Tom to send follow-up emails to anyone who's providing revisions. And I think, as I say, we might be reaching out if you said something in that part of the meeting. After the draft report is revised, we'll send it for final concurrence, and then it will be transmitted to EPA. And this, I think what was agreed in the motion was that Dr. Allen and I would be part of that process as well, looking at the changes. And let's see, so we'll implement the board's decisions about the planned regulatory actions that the work group had already screened for us. And that concludes our business. Are there any additional questions from board members? And if not, I'll turn back to Tom Armitage.
I have something I want to share, Allison.
Yes, please.
I'm excited. I know I've said this before, but we're getting closer. The panels are going to start meeting in person. And I'm very excited about that. I'm looking forward to seeing everybody. I think we've done a really good job in this format, and it probably better than I hoped and expected, but it doesn't always replace the dynamic relationship and interaction you get from face-to-face meetings. So I'm excited. I believe the first one that we're going to have is the BenMap panel, which will be down in RTP, and Dr. Schindel is chairing that one. So thank you, Drew. And it's just the first of many. We have a very big, very busy schedule for spring and early summer. And those meetings will all have a hybrid approach. So if by chance you're under the weather or your flight gets messed up, or maybe you're not comfortable traveling for whatever reason, you will have an option to participate via Zoom. But I'm looking forward to seeing everyone in person and excited about that.
Thank you. Yeah, looking at all these little boxes on the screen, it's yeah, we could be a lot more interactive than this. So thank you. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's time.
It is time. All right. Any other additions, or shall we move to our closing statement from Tom Armitage? Tom, it looks like we're ready. Thank you so much once again.
Great. I just want to add my thanks. Thank everyone for all their work. And we got through this very efficiently today. So thank you. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Take care.